Section 29 of Benjamin Franklin's Self-Revealed, Volume 2, by William Bruce. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5, Part 2, Franklin as a Writer. Franklin has left behind him his own conception of what constitutes a good piece of writing. To be good, he says, it ought to have a tendency to benefit the reader by improving his virtue or his knowledge, but not regarding the intention of the author. The method should be just. That is, it should proceed regularly from things known to things unknown, distinctly and clearly without confusion. The words used should be the most expressive that the language affords, provided that they are the most generally understood. Nothing should be expressed in two words that can be as well expressed in one. That is, no synonyms should be used, or very rarely, but the whole should be as short as possible, consistent with clearness. The words should be so placed as to be agreeable to the ear in reading. Summarily, it should be smooth, clear, and short, for the contrary qualities are displeasing. Though entirely familiar, as we know from one of his letters, with the fate that befell Gil Blas, when he was so imprudent as to comply with the invitation of his master, the Archbishop, Franklin did not shrink from the peril of telling Benjamin Vaughan, at his request, what the faults of his writings were, and the terms in which he performed this delicate and hazardous office were suggested in part at least by his own methods of composition. Your language, he told Vaughan, seems to me to be good and pure, and your sentiments generally just, but your style of composition wants perspicuity, and this I think owing principally to a neglect of method. What I would therefore recommend to you is that, before you sit down to write on any subject, you would spend some days in considering it, putting down at the same time in short hints every thought which occurs to you as proper to make a part of your intended piece. When you have thus obtained a collection of the thoughts, examine them carefully with this view, to find which of them is properest to be presented first to the mind of the reader, that he, being possessed of that, may the more easily understand it, and be better disposed to receive what you intend for the second. And thus I would have you put a figure before each thought to mark its future place in your composition. For so, every preceding proposition preparing the mind for that which is to follow, and the reader often anticipating it, he proceeds with ease and pleasure and approbation, as seeming continually to meet with his own thoughts. In this mode you have a better chance for a perfect production, because the mind attending first to the sentiments alone, next to the method alone, each part is likely to be better performed, and I think, too, in less time. The writings of Franklin as a whole were true to his literary ideals, for they are, as a rule, smooth, clear, and short, and the paper of preliminary hints that he drew up for the composition of the Autobiography was in accord with his advice to Vaughan in regard to the value of such aids to perspicuity. His familiar letters, agreeable as they are, bear evidence at times of haste and lack of revision, and even his more informal writings, other than letters, occasionally betray a certain sort of carelessness of construction and expression. This is conspicuously true of the Autobiography, and indeed it is one of the merits of that work, so perfectly is it in keeping with its easy, meandering narrative. But generally speaking, the compositions of Franklin are fully in harmony with his best standards of literary accomplishment. They are flowing and euphonious, moving with a steady, smooth, and sometimes powerful current from things known to things unknown, distinctly and lucidly without confusion. They are as clear as a trout stream. If one of his sentences is read a second time, it is not for his meaning, but merely for a renewal of the gratification that the mind derives from a thought presented free from the slightest trace of intercepting obscurity. They are so concise that the endeavor to make an abstract of one of them is likely to result in a sacrifice of brevity. But smoothness, clearness, and brevity are far from being the only merits of Franklin's writings. He was not richly endowed with imagination, though he was by no means destitute of that sovereign faculty, placid and sober as the ordinary operations of his mind were. But fancy, the graceful sister of imagination, invention, wit, and humour, and remarkable powers of statement and reasoning, all, except humour, in its more wayward moods, under the complete sway of a sound judgment, gave life and strength to almost all that he wrote. His similes and metaphors are often strikingly original and apt, never more so than when they light up with a sudden flash the dark core of some abstruse scientific problem. A vivacity of spirits that nothing could long depress, accompanied by a quick but kindly sense of the ludicrous, rises like bubbles of mellow wine to the surface of his intimate letters and other lighter compositions, and when associated with conceptions lured from the bright heaven of invention and elaborated with the utmost finish, as in the case of his bagatelles, imparts to his productions a quality that does not belong to any but the best creations of literary genius. It is interesting to note how even the most intractable subject, the new invented Pennsylvania fireplace, smoky chimneys, interest calculations, become suffused with some sort of intellectual charm, born of absolute transparency of speech, if nothing else, as soon as they pass through the luminous and tapestried cells of his spacious mind. That mind, indeed, like all minds of the same comprehensive character, in which the balance has not been lost between the subjective and objective faculties, was prone to see everything in large pictorial outlines. Fable, epilogue, parable, a story that was not so much the jest of a moment as the wisdom of all time, a historical incident that pointed some grave moral or enforced some invaluable truth, came naturally to his mind, as they might well do to the minds of all men who are creed founders or teachers, in any sense on a large scale of the mass of men as he was. How naturally such methods of instruction belong to him is well illustrated in the story told of him by John Adams. One evening at a social gathering, shortly before he left England at the close of his second mission to that country, a gentleman expressed the opinion that writers like Aesop and La Fontaine had exhausted the resources of fable. Franklin, so far from concurring with this view, declared that many new and instructive fables could still be invented, and when asked whether he could think of one, replied that if he was furnished with pen and paper, he would produce one forthwith. The pen and paper were handed to him, and in a few minutes he summed up the existing relations between England and America in this fable. Once upon a time an eagle, scaling round a farmer's barn, and espying a hare, darted down upon him like a sunbeam, seized him in his claws, and remounted with him in the air. He soon found that he had a creature of more courage and strength than a hare, for which, notwithstanding the keenness of his eyesight, he had mistaken a cat. The snarling and scrambling of the prey was very inconvenient, and what was worse, she had disengaged herself from his talons, grasped his body with her forelimbs, so as to stop his breath, and seized fast hold of his throat with her teeth. "Pray," said the eagle, "let go your hold, and I will release you." "Very fine," said the cat. "I have no fancy to fall from this height and be crushed to death. You have taken me up, and you shall stoop and let me down." The eagle thought it necessary to stoop accordingly. In the course of the preceding pages we have had occasion to refer at considerable length to not a few of Franklin's writings, but by no means to all. Among the best of his published pamphlets is the one entitled "The Interest of Great Britain considered with regard to her colonies and the acquisitions of Canada and Guadeloupe." Remarkable as it may now seem, when the peace of 1763 between Great Britain and France was approaching, there was some division of opinion in the former country as to whether she should insist upon the cession by France to her of Canada or Guadeloupe, then one of the rich sugar islands of the West Indies. And the object of this pamphlet was to establish the superior claims of Canada. It is written with great lucidity and force of argument, and is especially valuable for its revelations of the extent to which the acquisition of Canada by England was opposed in England for fear that it would tend to augment the power and precipitate the independence of the American colonies. Richard Jackson is alleged to have had a share in its composition, exactly what Benjamin Vaughan was unable to say after a careful investigation before the publication of his edition of Franklin's writings in 1779. For our part, we find it difficult to believe that he could have had any considerable share in its production. Internal evidences of authorship are undoubtedly misleading, but it is hard to read this paper, so similar to Franklin's other pamphlets in point of peculiarities of diction and method, without exclaiming, "St. Dunstan or the devil!" Its intimate, nay, perfect familiarity with Indian habits and characteristics could not well have been possessed by any one who had never personally mixed with the Indians, and formed his knowledge of them from his own and other first-hand information. The arguments, too, employed in the pamphlet to allay English jealousy of colonial aggrandizement are the same that are found scattered through Franklin's other writings. There is also the fact that the authorship of the paper is referred to in the paper itself throughout in the first person singular. There is also the fact that in the same letter to Hume, in which Franklin disclaims the authorship of the Historical Review, he told him, in reply to one of his criticisms, that he gave up as rather low the word unshakable used in the Canada pamphlet, but said nothing to indicate that the pamphlet was not wholly his own. More conclusive are the words in the paper of hints upon which the composition of the Autobiography was based. Canada delenda est, my pamphlet, its reception and effect. Certainly a man whose relations to his own productions were always marked by an uncommon degree of modesty, if not of indifference, and whose generosity in awarding due credit to the labours of others was one of his most striking and laudable qualities, was scarcely the man to have used such words as these about a pamphlet, mainly or largely the work of another hand. There is, besides, the fact that in the Franklin collection of the Pennsylvania Historical Society there is a copy of the pamphlet endorsed in the handwriting of Franklin as presented to the Reverend Dr. Mayhew from his humble servant, the author. In view of these circumstances, we should say that the probabilities decidedly are that the connection of Jackson with the pamphlet, whatever it may have been, was of a purely subordinate character. The papers written by Franklin from time to time during the controversy between Great Britain and her colonies, before the sword grew too impatient to remain in its scabbard, such as his letters to the London Chronicle and the London Public Advertiser, his answers to Strahan's queries respecting American affairs, his essay on toleration in Old England and New England, his tract relative to the affair of Hutchinson's letters, and his account of negotiations in London for effecting a reconciliation between Great Britain and the American colonies, were taken as a whole pamphleteering or narration of a very interesting and effective order. The substance of the majority of them is found in his examination before the House of Commons, as the quintessence of most that is best in Poor Richard's Almanac is found in Father Abraham's speech. They are written, as a rule, in a singularly clear and readable style, present with unusual skill and cogency all the points of the colonial argument, and display the insight of an almost faultlessly honest and sane intelligence into the true obligations and interests of the mother country and her disaffected children. Among these graver productions, Franklin also contributed to the American controversy, in addition to the humorous letter to the press, in which he held up to English ignorance of America as one of the finest spectacles in nature the grand leap of the whale in his chase of the cod up Niagara Falls, two papers worthy of the satirical genius of Swift. One is his edict by the King of Prussia, and the other is his rules by which a great empire may be reduced to a small one. In the first piece, Frederick the Great is gravely credited with an edict, in which, after reciting that Great Britain was colonized in the beginning by subjects of his renowned ducal ancestors, led by Hengist, Horsa, Hela, Ulf, Surdicus, Ida, and others, he proceeds to impose seriatim upon the English descendants of these German colonists in terms exactly like those employed by the prohibitory and restrictive statutes of Great Britain, bearing upon the commerce and industry of America all the disabilities and burdens under which America labored. The parallel is sustained with unbroken spirit and the happiest irony from beginning to end. After all the manacles by which the freedom of America was restrained have been duly fastened by the arbitrary mandates of the edict upon Great Britain herself, it concludes with these words: "We flatter ourselves that these our royal regulations and commands will be thought just and reasonable by our much favoured colonists in England, the said regulations being copied from their statutes of 10 and 11, William III, copy 10.5, Geo. 2, c. 22.23, George II, c. 29.4, Geo. 1, c. 11, and from other equitable laws made by their parliaments, or from instructions given by their princes, or from resolutions of both houses, entered into for the good government of their own colonies in Ireland and America." The second paper commences in this matter. An ancient sage boasted that though he could not fiddle, he knew how to make a great city of a little one. The science that I, a modern simpleton, am about to communicate is the very reverse. Then, assuming as a postulate that a great empire, like a great cake, is most easily diminished at the edges, the paper goes on to point out one by one, as the best means for reducing such an empire to a small one, the very British policies and abuses that were then producing incurable disaffection in the mind of America and menacing the power and prestige of Great Britain herself. These two papers, though clothed in forms that belong to literature rather than to politics, assert the whole case of the colonies against Great Britain almost, if not altogether, as fully as the Declaration of Independence afterwards did. They have in every respect the polished completeness given by Franklin to all the productions of his pen that call for the exercise of true literary art, and deserve to be included in any separate publication of the best creations of his literary genius. They both met with the popular favour that they merited. The Rules was read with such eagerness that it was reprinted in the Public Advertiser at the request of many individuals and some associations of individuals, and this notwithstanding the fact that it had been copied in several other newspapers and the Gentleman's Magazine. So great was the demand for the issue of the Advertiser, in which the edict appeared, that the day after its appearance Franklin's clerk could obtain but 2 copies of it, though he endeavoured to obtain more, both at the office of the Advertiser and elsewhere. Its authorship being unknown except to a few of the writer's friends, he had the pleasure, besides, he tells us, of hearing it spoken of in the highest terms as the keenest and severest piece that had been published in London for a long time. Lord Mansfield, he was informed, said of it that it was very able and artful indeed, and would do mischief by giving in England a bad impression of the measures of government, and in the colonies by encouraging them in their contumacy. Among the persons taken in by its apparent genuineness was Paul Whitehead. "I was down at Lord de Despence's," Franklin wrote to William Franklin, "when the post brought that day's papers. Mr. Whitehead was there too, Paul Whitehead, the author of Manners, who runs early through all the papers and tells the company what he finds remarkable. He had then in another room, and we were chatting in the breakfast parlour, when he came running into us, out of breath, with the paper in his hand. 'Here,' says he, 'here's news for ye. Here's the King of Prussia claiming a right to his kingdom.' All stared, and I as much as anybody, and he went on to read it. When he had read 2 or 3 paragraphs, a gentleman present said, 'Damn his impudence! I dare say we shall hear by next post that he is upon his march, with 100,000 men to back this.' Whitehead, who is very shrewd, soon after began to smoke it, and, looking in my face, said, 'I'll be hanged if this is not some of your American jokes upon us.' The reading went on, and ended with abundance of laughing, and a general verdict that it was a fair hit, and the piece was cut out of the paper and preserved in my lord's collection." There are some humorous passages and other contributions made by Franklin in one assumed character or another to the American controversy. The dialogue, as well as the fable, was, as the reader is aware, one of his striking methods of arresting popular attention when he wished to make an impression upon the popular mind. In an anonymous letter to the Public Advertiser, he undertook to defend Dr. Franklin from the charge of ingratitude to the ministry, which had, it was alleged, given him the Post Office of America, offered him a post of $500 a year in the Salt Office if he would relinquish the interests of his country, and made his son a colonial governor. As it was a settled point in government in England that every man had his price, it was plain the letter declared that the English ministers were bunglers in their business and had not given him enough. Their master had as much reason to be angry with them as Roderigo in the play with his apothecary for not effectually poisoning Pandolfo, and they must probably make use of the apothecary's justification as urged in the following colloquy. Scene 4, Roderigo and Fell, the apothecary. Roderigo. You promised to have this Pandolfo upon his bier in less than a week. 'Tis more than a month since, and he still walks and stares me in the face. Fell. True, and yet I have done my best endeavours. In various ways I have given the miscreant as much poison as would have killed an elephant. He has swallowed dose after dose. Far from hurting him, he seems the better for it. He hath a wonderfully strong constitution. I find I cannot kill him but by cutting his throat, and that, as I take it, is not my business. Roderigo. Then it must be mine. Another letter signed A Londoner illustrates the difficulty which the sober good sense of Franklin, always disposed to reduce things to their material terms, experienced in understanding the recklessness with which the British government was hazarding the commercial value of the colonies. To us in the way of trade comes now, and has long come, he said, all the superlucration arising from their labours. But will our reviling them as cheats, hypocrites, scoundrels, traitors, cowards, tyrants, etc., etc., according to the present court mode in all our papers, make them more our friends, more fond of our merchandise? Did ever any tradesman succeed who attempted to drub customers into his shop? And will honest John Bull, the farmer, be long satisfied with servants that before his face attempt to kill his plough horses? In his eager desire to influence public sentiment in England in behalf of the colonies, Franklin even devised and distributed a rude copper plate engraving, visualizing the woeful condition to which Great Britain would be reduced if she persisted in her harsh and unwise conduct towards her colonies. Many impressions of this engraving were struck off at his request on the cards which he occasionally used in writing his notes, and the design he also had printed for circulation on half sheets of paper, with an explanation and a moral of his composition. The details of the illustration, which are all duly elucidated in the explanation, are those of abject and irredeemable ruin. The limbs of Britannia, duly labelled Virginia, Pennsylvania, New York, and New England respectively, lie scattered about her, and she herself, with her eyes and arm stumps uplifted to heaven, is seen sliding off the globe with a streamer inscribed Date Obelum Belisario thrown across all that remains of her legs. Her shield, which she is unable to handle, lies useless by her side. The leg labelled New England has been transfixed by her lance. The hand of the arm labelled Pennsylvania has released its grasp upon a small spray of laurel. The English oak has lost its crown and stands a bare trunk with briars and thorns at its feet, and a single dry branch sticks out from its side. In the background are Britannia's ships with brooms at their top mastheads, denoting that they are for sale. The moral of the whole was that the Thames and the Ohio, Edinburgh and Dublin were all one, and that invidious discriminations in favour of one part of the empire to the prejudice of the rest could not fail to be attended with the most disastrous consequences to the whole state. Nothing produced by Franklin between the date of his return from his second mission to England and his departure from America for France needs to be noticed. The 2 or 3 papers from his pen which belong to this period are distinctly below his ordinary standards of composition. nor are any of the graver writings composed by him during the remainder of his life, with some exceptions, very noteworthy. In one, his comparison of Great Britain and the United States in regard to the basis of credit in the two countries, he presented, with no little ability, the proposition that by reason of general industry, frugality, ability, prudence, and virtue, America was a much safer debtor than Britain, to say nothing of the satisfaction that generous minds were bound to feel in reflecting that by loans to America they were opposing tyranny and aiding the cause of liberty, which was the cause of all mankind. The object of this paper was to forward the loan of 2 millions of pounds sterling that the United States were desirous of procuring abroad. Unfortunately, the matter was one not to be settled by argument by the Bourse, which has a barometric reasoning of its own. In another paper, thrown into the form of a catechism, Franklin, by a series of clever questions and answers, brings to the attention of the world the fact that it would take 148 years, 109 days, and 22 hours for a man to count the English national debt, though he counted at the rate of 100 shillings per minute during 12 hours of each day; that the shillings making up this enormous sum would weigh 61,752,476 troy pounds; that it would take 314 ships of 100 tons each, or 31,452 carts to move them; and that if laid close together in a straight line, they would stretch more than twice around the circumference of the earth, are and other facts elicited by the questions of the catechism. It concludes in this manner. Question: when will government be able to pay the principal? Answer: when there is more money in England's treasury than there is in all Europe. Question: and when will that be? Answer: never. This was very ingenious and clever, and has been imitated 100 times over since by ad capitam statisticians, but it needed an interest default on the part of John Bull to make it effective. Franklin's conceit in the edict that Saxony was as much the mother country of England as England was of America was, it must be admitted, made to do rather more than its share of service. It reappeared in his vindication and offer from Congress to Parliament, when, in repelling the charge that America was ungrateful to England, he said that there was much more reason for retorting that charge on Britain, which not only never contributed any aid, nor afforded by an exclusive commerce any advantages to Saxony, her mother country, but no longer since then the last war, without the least provocation, subsidized the King of Prussia, while he ravaged that mother country and carried fire and sword into its capital, the fine city of Dresden. The same conceit also appeared a second time in the dialogue between Britain, France, Spain, Holland, Saxony, and America, which he wrote soon after he arrived in France as one of our envoys. In this lively dialogue, Britain beseeches Spain, France, and Holland successively not to supply America with arms. Spain reminds her of her intervention in behalf of the Dutch and expresses surprise at her impudence. France reminds her of her intervention in behalf of the Huguenots and tells her that she must be a little silly, and Holland ends by informing her defiantly that, with the prospect of a good market for brimstone, Holland, would make no scruple of even sending her ships to hell and supplying the devil with it. America then takes a hand and denounces Britain as a bloodthirsty bully, to which Britain replies as quickly as her choking rage will permit by denouncing America as a wicked Whig Presbyterian serpent. To this America rejoins with the statement that she will not surrender her liberty and property, but with her life, and some additional statements which cause Britain to exclaim, "You impudent bitch! Am not I your mother country? Is that not a sufficient title to your respect and obedience?" At this point Saxony for the first time breaks in. "Mother country! Ha, ha! He! What respect have you the front to claim as a mother country? You know that I am your mother country, and yet you pay me none. Nay, it is but the other day that you hired ruffians to rob me on the highway and burn my house. For shame, hide your face and hold your tongue. If you continue this conduct, you will make yourself the contempt of Europe." This is too much for even the assurance of the dauntless termagant, who, before the American War was over, was to be engaged in conflict at one time with every one of the other parties to the dialogue except Saxony. "O Lord," she exclaims in despair, "where are my friends?" The question does not remain long unanswered. France, Spain, Holland, and Saxony all together. Friends, believe us, you have none, nor ever will have any, till you mend your manners. How can we, who are your neighbors, have any regard for you, or expect any equity from you, should your power increase, when we see how basely and unjustly you have used both your own mother and your own children? With such rollicking fun did Franklin beguile his Gibeonite tasks. A letter of information to those who would remove to America, an essay on the elective franchises enjoyed by the small boroughs in England, the 3 essays on smoky chimneys, the new stove, and maritime topics, the retort courteous, in which some pithy reasons were given why Americans were slow in paying their old debts to British merchants, the observations relative to the intentions of the original founders of the Academy in Philadelphia, the address of the Pennsylvania Society for promoting the abolition of slavery and the relief of free negroes unlawfully held in bondage, the plan for improving the condition of the free blacks, the essay on the internal state of America, and the paper on good Whig principles make up the bulk of the graver pamphlets and papers written by Franklin between the beginning of his mission to France and his death. Some, if not all of them, have already come in for our attention, and most of them invite no special comment. All, like everything that he wrote, even the marginalia on the books that he read, have some kind of salt in them that keeps them sweet, assert itself as time will. End of section 29. Section 30 of Benjamin Franklin, Self-Revealed, Volume 2, by William Bruce. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5, Part 3, Franklin as a Writer. Other serious papers of Franklin, not inspired by political motives, belong to an earlier date, and with the exception of those to which we have more than barely referred in previous chapters of this book, call for a word of comment. 2. The hints for those that would be rich, and the advice to young tradesmen, are merely echoes of Poor Richard's Almanac, but are good examples of the teachings that make Franklin the most effective of all propagandists. He that loses 5 shillings not only loses that sum, but all the advantage that might be made by turning it in dealing, which by the time that a young man becomes old amounts to a comfortable bag of money. This is a typical sentence taken from the Hints. After reading such a discourse as the advice to a young tradesman, it is easy enough to see why it was that pecuniary truisms took on new life when vitalized by the mind of Franklin. Money, he tells the young tradesman, is of the prolific generating nature. He that kills a breeding sow destroys all her offspring to the 1000th generation. He that murders a crown destroys all that it might have produced, even scores of pounds. The young novice is also told that the most trifling actions that affect a man's credit are to be regarded. The sound of your hammer at 5 in the morning or 9 at night, heard by a creditor, makes him easy 6 months longer. But if he sees you at a billiard table, or hears your voice at a tavern, when you should be at work, he sends for his money the next day. The paper ends with this pointed sermon. In short, the way to wealth, if you desire it, is as plain as the way to market. It depends chiefly on 2 words, industry and frugality, that is, waste neither time nor money, but make the best use of both. Without industry and frugality nothing will do, and with them everything. He that gets all he can honestly and saves all he gets, necessary expenses excepted, will certainly become rich, if that being who governs the world, to whom all should look for a blessing on their honest endeavours, doth not in his wise providence otherwise determine. Scattered through the works of Franklin are various miscellaneous productions of no slight literary value. The parable against persecution was an ancient conception, old, we are told by Jeremy Taylor in his Liberty of Prophesying, as the Jews' books. Franklin never claimed more credit for it, as he stated in a letter to Vaughan, than what related to the style and the addition of the concluding, threatening, and promise. These qualifications, however, leave him quite a different measure of credit from that of an artist who merely touches up a portrait by another hand, as a perusal of the parable will satisfy any reader. The incident upon which the story turns is the reception by Abraham into his tent of a stranger who fails to bless God at meat. Abraham expels him from the tent with blows for not worshipping the Most High God, creator of heaven and earth, only to be rebuked by the Almighty in these impressive words: "Have I borne with him these 198 years, and nourished him and clothed him, notwithstanding his rebellion against me? And couldst not thou, who art thyself a sinner, bear with him one night?" Only less felicitous was Franklin's parable on brotherly love. Simeon, Levi, and Judah are successively denied by their brother Reuben the use of an axe which he had bought of the Ishmaelite merchants, and which he highly prized. Therefore they buy axes themselves from the Ishmaelites, and as luck will have it, while Reuben is hewing timber on the river bank, his axe slips into the water and is lost. Reuben then applies to each of his three brothers in turn for the use of their axes. Simeon reminds him of his selfishness and flatly refuses. Levi reproaches him, but adds that he will be better than he, and will lend his axe to him. Reuben, however, is too ashamed to accept it. Judah, seeing the grief and shame in his countenance, anticipates the request and exclaims, "My brother, I know thy loss, but why should it trouble thee? Lo, have I not an axe that will serve both thee and me?" And then the lovely parable continues in these words: "And Reuben fell on his neck and kissed him with tears, saying, Thy kindness is great, but thy goodness in forgiving me is greater. Thou art indeed my brother, and whilst I live will I surely love thee." And Judah said, "Let us also love our other brethren. Behold, are we not all of one blood?" And Joseph saw these things and reported them to his father Jacob. And Jacob said, Reuben did wrong, but he repented. Simeon also did wrong, and Levi was not altogether blameless. But the heart of Judah is princely. Judah hath the soul of a king. His father's children shall bow down before him, and he shall rule over his brethren. The papers contributed by Franklin to the Busybody and the Pennsylvania Gazette clearly indicate the influence of Addison and Steele. The Redentius and Eugenius of the second issue, Redentius the white, who gave himself an hour's diversion on the cock of a man's hat, the heels of his shoes, or on one of his unguarded expressions or personal defects; Eugenius, who preferred to make himself a public jest rather than be at the pains of seeing his friend in confusion. Pale phantoms though they be, are palpably imitations of the Spectator and Tatler. So are the Cato of the third issue of the Busybody, whose countenance revealed habits of virtue that made one forget his homespun linen and 7 days' beard, and the Critico of the same issue, the sour philosopher who commanded nothing better from his dependents than the submissive deportment which was like the worship paid by the Indians to the devil. Unlike these characters, the Patience of the fourth issue of the Busybody is a real creature of flesh and blood. She writes to the Busybody for advice, informing him that she is a single woman and keeps a shop in the town for her livelihood, and has a certain neighbor who is really agreeable company enough, and has for some time been an intimate of hers, but who of late has tried her out of all patience by her frequent and long visits. She cannot do a thing in the world, but this friend must know all about it, and her friend has besides 2 children just big enough to run about and do petty mischief, who accompany their mother on her visits and put things in the shop out of sorts, so that the writer has all the trouble and pesterment of children without the pleasure of calling them her own. Pray, sir, concludes the unhappy Patience, tell me what I shall do, and talk a little against such unreasonable visiting in your next paper, though I would not have her affronted with me for a great deal, for sincerely I love her and her children, as well, I think, as a neighbour can, and she buys a great many things in a year at my shop. But I would beg her to consider that she uses me unmercifully, though I believe it is only for want of thought. But I have 20 things more to tell you besides all this. There is a handsome gentleman that has a mind, I don't question, to make love to me, but he can't get the least opportunity to. Oh dear, here she comes again. I must conclude. Yours, etc. This letter is made the subject of some sensible comments by the busybody on the importance of remembering the words of the wise man, withdraw thy foot from the house of thy neighbour, lest he grow weary of thee, and so hate thee. Later, the same caution was to be conveyed in Poor Richard's Fish and Visitors' Smell after 3 days. The paper ends with the approval by the busybody of the Turkish practice of admonishing guests that it is time for them to go, without actually asking them to do so, by having a chafing dish with the grateful incense of smoking aloes rising from it brought into the room and applied to their beards. Even more lifelike than Patience are Anthony Afterwood, Celia Single, Mr. and Mrs. Careless, and Alice Atherton, the figures brought to our eye by the Pennsylvania Gazette. Indeed, Addison himself would have had no occasion to be ashamed of them if they had been figments of his own fancy. In his letter to the editor of the Gazette, Anthony Afterwood told him that about the time that he first addressed his spouse, her father let it be known that if she married a man of his liking, he would give £200 with her on the day of marriage, and that he had made some fine plans, and had even in some measure neglected his business on the strength of this assurance, but that when the old gentleman saw that the writer was pretty well engaged, he, without assigning any reason, grew very angry, forbade him the house, and told his daughter that, if she married him, he would not give her a farthing. However, as the father foresaw, he stole a wedding, and took his wife to his house, where they were not in quite so poor a condition as the couple described in the Scotch song, who had neither pot nor pan, but 4 bare legs together. For he had a house tolerably furnished for an ordinary man. His wife, however, was strongly inclined to be a gentlewoman. His old-fashioned looking-glass was one day broke. No mortal could tell which way, she said, and was succeeded by a large fashionable one. This in turn led to another table more suitable to such a glass, and the new table to some very handsome chairs. Thus by degrees he found all his old furniture stored up in the garret, and everything below altered for the better. Then, on one pretext or another, came along a tea-table with all its appurtenances of china and silver, a maid, a clock, and a pacing-mare, for which he paid £20. The result was that, receiving a very severe dun, which mentioned the next court, he began in earnest to project relief. His dear having gone over the river the preceding Monday to see a relation, and stay a fortnight because she could not bear the heat of the town, he took his turn at alterations. He dismissed the maid, bag and baggage. He sold the pacing-mare, and bought a good milch cow with £3 of the money. He disposed of the tea-table, and put a spinning-wheel in its place. He stuffed 9 empty tea canisters with flax, and with some of the money he derived from the sale of the tea furniture, he bought a set of knitting needles. For to tell you a truth, which I would have go no farther, added honest Anthony, I begin to want stockings. The stately clock he transformed into an hourglass, by which he had gained a good round sum, and one of the pieces of the old looking-glass, squared and framed, supplied the place of the old one. In short, the face of things was quite changed, and he had paid his debts and found money in his pocket. His good dame was expected home next Friday, and if she could conform with his new scheme of living, they would be the happiest couple perhaps in the province, and by the blessings of God might soon be in thriving circumstances. He had reserved the great glass for her, and he would allow her, when she came in, to be taken suddenly ill with the headache, stomach ache, the fainting fits, or whatever other disorder she might think more proper, and she might retire to bed as soon as she pleased. But if he did not find her in perfect health, both of body and mind, the next morning away would go the aforesaid great glass, with several other trinkets, to the vendue that very day. That the wife of Anthony did succumb to the situation we know, for it was an unfortunate reference to her that caused Celia Single to write her letter to the editor of the Gazette. During the morning of the preceding Wednesday, she said, she happened to be in at Mrs. Careless when the husband of that lady returned from market, and showed his wife some balls of thread which he had bought. "My dear," says he, "I like mightily these stockings, which I yesterday saw neighbour Afterwit knitting for her husband, of thread of her own spinning. I should be glad to have some such stockings myself. I understand that your maid Mary is a very good knitter, and seeing this thread in market, I bought it, that the girl may make a pair or two for me." Then, according to Celia, there took place in her presence a dialogue between husband and wife so animated, that knowing as she did that a man and his wife are apt to quarrel more violently when before strangers than when by themselves, she got up and went out hastily. She was glad, however, to understand from Mary, who came to her of an errand in the evening, that the couple dined together pretty peaceably, the balls of thread that had caused the difference being thrown into the kitchen fire. The story, beginning with the reply of Mrs. Careless to the offensive suggestion of Mr. Careless, is too good not to be reproduced in full. Mrs. Careless was just then at the glass, dressing her head, and turning about with the pins in her mouth. "Lord, child," says she, "are you crazy? What time is Mary to knit? Who must do the work? I wonder if you set her to knitting." "Perhaps, my dear," says he, "you have a mind to knit 'em yourself. I remember when I courted you, I once heard you say that you had learned to knit of your mother." "I knit stockings for you," says she. "Not I, truly. There are poor women enough in town that can knit. If you please, you may employ them." "Well, but, my dear," says he, "you know a penny saved is a penny got. A pin a day is a groat a year. Every little makes a muckle, and there's neither sin nor shame in knitting a pair of stockings. Why should you express such a mighty aversion to it? As to poor women, you know we are not people of quality. We have no income to maintain us but what arises from my labour and industry. Methinks you should not be at all displeased if you have an opportunity to get something as well as myself." "I wonder," says she, "how you can propose such a thing to me. Did not you always tell me you would maintain me like a gentlewoman? If I'd married Captain So-and-so, he would have scorned even to mention knitting of stockings." "Prithee," says he, a little nettled, "what do you tell me of your captains? If you could have had him, I suppose you would, or perhaps you did not very well like him. If I did promise to maintain you like a gentlewoman, I suppose 'tis time enough for that, when you know how to behave like one. Meanwhile, 'tis your duty to help make me able. How long do you think I can maintain you at your present rate of living?" "Pray," says she, somewhat fiercely, and dashing the puff into the powder-box, "don't use me after this manner, for I assure you I won't bear it. This is the fruit of your poisoned newspapers. There shall come no more here, I promise you." "Bless us," says he, "what an unaccountable thing is this! Must a tradesman's daughter, and the wife of a tradesman, necessarily and instantly be a gentlewoman? You had no portion. I am forced to work for a living. You are too great to do the like. There's the door. Go and live upon your estate, if you can find it. In short, I don't desire to be troubled with ye." And then it was that Celia Single gathered up her skirts and left. The letter from Alice Athertongue to the editor of the Gazette is exactly in the manner of the School for Scandal, written many years later. She is a young girl of about 35, she says, and lives at present with her mother, like the emperor who, if a day passed over his head during which he had conferred no benefit on any man, was in the habit of saying, Diem perditi, I have lost a day. She would make use of the same expression were it possible for a day to pass over her head during which she had failed to scandalize someone, a misfortune, thanks be praised, that had not befallen her these dozen years. My mother, good woman, and I, for the forked tongue plays precisely as it might have done in the mouth of Lady Sneerwell, have heretofore differed upon this account. She argued that scandal spoilt all good conversation, and I insisted that without it there would be no such thing. Our disputes once rose so high that we parted tea-tables, and I concluded to entertain my acquaintance in the kitchen. The first day of this separation we both drank tea at the same time, but she with her visitors in the parlour. She would not hear of the least objection to any one's character, but began a new sort of discourse in some queer philosophical manner as this. I am mightily pleased sometimes, says she, when I observe and consider that the world is not so bad as people out of humour imagine it to be. There is something amiable, some good quality or other, in everybody. If we were only to speak of people that are least respected, there is such a one as is very dutiful to her father, and methinks has a fine set of teeth. Such a one is very respectful to her husband. Such a one is very kind to her poor neighbours, and besides has a very handsome shape. Such a one is always ready to serve a friend, and in my opinion there is not a woman in town that has more agreeable air and gait. This fine kind of talk, which lasted near half an hour, she concluded by saying, I do not doubt but every one of you have made the like observations, and I should be glad to have the conversation continued upon this subject. Just at that juncture I peeped in at the door, and never in my life before saw such a set of simple vacant countenances. They looked somehow neither glad nor sorry, nor angry, nor pleased, nor indifferent, nor attentive, but, excuse the simile, like so many blue wooden images of Rideau. I in the kitchen, and already begun a ridiculous story of Mr. Blank's intrigue with his maid, and his wife's behaviour upon the discovery. At some passages we laughed heartily, and one of the gravest of mamma's company, without making any answer to her discourse, got up to go and see what the girls were so merry about. She was followed by a second, and shortly by a third, till at last the old gentlewoman found herself quite alone, and being convinced that her project was impracticable, came herself and finished her tea with us, ever since which Saul also has been among the prophets, and our disputes lie dormant. It was in the Pennsylvania Gazette, too, that Franklin published his dialogue between Philocles and Horatio, in which Philocles twice meets Horatio in the fields, and in accents full of persuasive blandishment, diverts his feet from the pursuit of sensual pleasure into paths of contentment and peace. In the first dialogue, the moralist takes as his thesis the proposition that self-denial is not only the most reasonable, but the most pleasant thing in the world. In the second, he holds up to Horatio the constant and durable happiness, so unlike the checkered fleeting pleasures of sense, which springs from acts of humanity, friendship, generosity, and benevolence. One maxim in the last dialogue is worth many of the sayings of Poor Richard. The foundation of all virtue and happiness is thinking rightly. Other papers from the hand of Franklin that appeared in the Gazette were A Witch Trial at Mount Holly, An Apology for Printers, A Meditation on a Quart Mug, Shavers and Trimmers, and Exporting of Felons to the Colonies. In The Witch Trial at Mount Holly, Franklin describes in a highly humorous manner the results of the ordeals to which a man and a woman, accused by a man and a woman of witchcraft, were subjected. One of these ordeals consisted in weighing the accused in scales against a Bible, for the purpose of seeing whether it would prove too heavy for them. Then, the facetious narrative relates, came out of the house a grave tall man, carrying the Holy Writ before the supposed wizard, etc. As solemnly as the sword-bearer of London before the Lord Mayor, the wizard was first put in the scale, and over him was read a chapter out of the books of Moses, and then the Bible was put in the other scale, which, being kept down before, was immediately let go. But to the great surprise of the spectators, flesh and bones came down plump, and outweighed the great good book by abundance. After the same manner the others were served, and their lumps of mortality severally were too heavy for Moses and all the prophets and apostles. This ordeal was followed by the trial by water. Both accused and accusers were stripped, except that the women were not deprived of their shifts, bound hand and foot, let down into the water by ropes from the side of a barge. The rest is thus told. The accused man, being thin and spare, with some difficulty began to sink at last, but the rest, every one of them, swam very light upon the water. A sailor in the flat jumped out upon the back of the man accused, thinking to drive him down to the bottom, but the person bound without any help came up some time before the other. The woman accuser, being told that she did not sink, would be ducked a second time, when she swam again as light as before. Upon which she declared that she believed the accused had bewitched her to make her so light, and that she would be ducked again 100 times, but she would duck the devil out of her. The accused man, being surprised at his own swimming, was not so confident of his innocence as before, but said, "If I am a witch, it is more than I know." The more thinking part of the spectators were of opinion that any person so bound and placed in the water, unless they were mere skin and bones, would swim till their breath was gone, and their lungs filled with water. But it being the general belief of the populace that the women's shifts and the garters with which they were bound helped to support them, it is said they are to be tried again the next warm weather naked. In the Apology for Printers, Franklin defends his guild with much point and good sense in terms modern enough to be fully applicable to newspapers at the present time. It was inspired by the resentment which his advertisements relating to sea hens in black gowns excited, and though written in a half-humorous style, states the difficulties of an editor between his duty to publish everything and the certainty of private resentment, if he does, with about as much felicity of presentation as they are ever likely to be stated. Among the various solid reasons set forth in formal numerical sequence that he gave by way of mitigation for publishing the advertisement, he mentioned these 2. 6, that I got 5 shillings by it. 7, that none who are angry with me would have given me so much to let it alone. In answer to the accusation that printers sometimes printed vicious or silly things not worth reading, he charged the fact up to the vicious taste of the public itself. He had known, he said, a very numerous impression of Robert Hood's songs to go off in the province at 2 shillings per book in less than a 12-month, when a small quantity of David's Psalms in excellent version had lain upon his hands about twice that long. In the Meditation on a Quart Mug, Franklin begins with the exclamation, "Wretched, miserable, and unhappy mug," and traces with mock sympathy all the misfortunes of its ignoble and squalid career from the time that it is first forced into the company of boisterous sots, who lay all their nonsense noise, profane swearing, cursing, and quarrelling on it, though it speaks not a word, until the inevitable hour when it is broken into pieces and finds its way for the most part back to Mother Earth. The paper is only a trifle, but a trifle fashioned with no little skill to hit the fancy of an age that, as Franklin's Drunkard's Vocabulary, also published in the Gazette, shows had innumerable cant terms for the condition for which the mug was held to such an unjust responsibility. The paper on shavers and trimmers is not so happy and well sustained, but its classifications of the different species of persons answering these descriptions is not without humour. One sentence in it, when Franklin speaks of the species of shavers and trimmers who cover what is called by an eminent preacher their poor dust in tinsel clothes and gaudy plumes of feathers, reads like a paragraph in the Courant. A competent share of religious horror thrown into the countenance, he says, with proper distortions of the face and the addition of a lank head of hair or a long wig and band, commands most profound respect to insolence and ignorance. The paper on the exporting of felons to the colonies is marked by the grim, biting irony of Swift, but was no severer than the practice of setting British criminals at large in America deserved. Such tender parental concern, Franklin said, called aloud for due returns of gratitude and duty, and he suggested that these returns should assume the form of rattlesnakes. Felons convict from the beginning of the world. In the spring of the year, when they first crept out of their holes, they were feeble, heavy, slow, and easily taken, and if a small bounty was allowed per head, some thousands might be collected annually and transported to Britain. There he proposed that they should be carefully distributed in St. James's Park, in the Spring Gardens, and other pleasure resorts about London, and in the gardens of all the nobility and gentry throughout the nation, but particularly in the gardens of the prime ministers, the lords of trade, and members of Parliament, for to them they were most particularly obliged. Such a paper, it is needless to say, was better calculated for its purpose than 1,000 appeals of the ordinary type would have been. The speech of Polly Baker is one of the most famous of Franklin's jeux d'esprit. The introduction to it states that it was delivered when she was prosecuted for the 5th time for having a bastard child, and with such effect that the court decided not to punish her, indeed with such effect that one of her judges even married her the next day, and in time had 15 children by her. The perfectly ingenuous manner in which the traverser refuses to admit that she has committed any offence whatever, and insists that in default of honourable suitors, she is but dutifully, though irregularly, complied with the first and great command of nature and nature's God, increase and multiply, is undoubtedly coarse, as it is a stroke of art, but the performance is too gross for modern scruples. More decorous reading is the fictitious discourse by a Spanish Jesuit on the means of disposing the enemy to peace, which Franklin, during his first mission to England, contributed to the London Chronicle for the purpose of rousing the English people to a sense of the artifices that were being employed by the French to build up a party in England for peace at any price. In the introduction to the discourse it is stated that it was taken from a book containing a number of discourses addressed by the Jesuit to the King of Spain in 1629, and that nothing was needed to render it apropos to the existing situation of England except the substitution of France for Spain. The discourse points out in detail, with shrewd insight, into all the selfish and timid impulses by which a society is corrupted or enervated, when cunningly practised upon the different classes in the country of the enemy, that could be manipulated in one way or another, until no sound but that of peace, peace, peace would be heard from any quarter. The craven streak is written in mock court language and replete with the subtle suggestions of household intimacy, is one of the most exquisite triumphs of Franklin's wit and fancy. This morning it begins: Queen Margaret, accompanied by her first maid of honour, Miss Franklin, Sally Franklin, set out for Rochester. Immediately on their departure the whole street was in tears from a heavy shower of rain. It is whispered that the new family administration which took place on Her Majesty's departure promises, like all other new administrations, to govern much better than the old one. We hear that the great person, so called from his enormous size, of a certain family in a certain street is grievously affected at the late changes, and could hardly be comforted this morning, though the new ministry promised him a roasted shoulder of mutton and potatoes for his dinner. It is said that the same great person intended to pay his respects to another great personage this day at St. James's, it being Coronation Day, hoping thereby a little to amuse his grief, but was prevented by an accident, Queen Margaret, or her maid of honour, having carried off the key of the drawers, so that the lady of the bedchamber could not come at a laced shirt for his Highness. Great clamours were made on this occasion against Her Majesty. And so the Gazette goes on, gay and graceful as the play of sunshine on the surface of a dimpled sea, from incident to incident that took place during the absence of Queen Margaret, Mrs. Stevenson, and Miss Franklin, investing each with a ceremonious dignity and importance that never descend to buffoonery. There are some of the occurrences chronicled as taking place on the first Sunday after the departure of the Queen. Walking up and down in his room, we might observe, was one of Franklin's ways of taking exercise. Lord and Lady Hewson walked after dinner to Kensington to pay their duty to the Dowager, and Dr. Fatsides made 469 turns in his dining-room as the exact distance of a visit to the lovely Lady Barwell, whom he did not find at home. So there was no struggle for and against a kiss, and he sat down to dream in the easy-chair that he had it without any trouble. And these are some of the observations made under the date of the succeeding Tuesday. It is remarked that the skies have wept every day in Craven Street the absence of the Queen. The public may be assured that this morning a certain great personage was asked very complacently by the mistress of the household if he would choose to have the blade bone of Saturday's mutton that had been kept for his dinner to-day, broiled or cold. He answered gravely, "If there is any flesh on it, it may be broiled. If not, it may as well be cold." Orders were accordingly given for broiling it, but when it came to table there was indeed so very little flesh, or rather none, puss having dined on it yesterday after Nanny, that if our new administration had been as good economists as they would be thought, the expense of broiling might well have been saved to the public and carried to the sinking fund. It is assured the great person bears all with infinite patience, but the nation is astonished at the insolent presumption that dares treat so much mildness in so cruel a manner. Under the same date is made the announcement that at 6 o'clock that afternoon news had come by the post that Her Majesty arrived safely at Rochester on Saturday night. The bells, the Gazette ads immediately rang for candles to illuminate the parlour. The court went into cribbage, and the evening concluded with every other demonstration of joy. This is followed by a letter to the Gazette from a person signing himself Indignation, who says that he makes no doubt of the truth of the statement that a certain great person is half-starved on the blade bone of a sheep by a set of the most careless, worthless, thoughtless, inconsiderate, corrupt, ignorant, blundering, foolish, crafty, and knavish ministers that ever got into a house and pretended to govern a family and provide a dinner. Alas for the poor old England of Craven Street, this correspondent exclaims. If they continue in power another week, the nation will be ruined, undone, totally undone, if I and my friends are not appointed to succeed them. This letter is accompanied by another signed "A Hater of Scandal," which takes Indignation to task, and declares that the writer believes that, even if the angel Gabriel would condescend to be their minister and provide their dinners, he would scarcely escape newspaper defamation from a gang of hungry, ever restless, discontented, and malicious scribblers. It was a piece of justice, he declared, that the publisher of the Gazette owed to their righteous administration to undeceive the public on this occasion by assuring them of the fact, which is that there was provided and actually smoking on the table under his royal nose at the same instant as the blade bone, as fine a piece of ribs of beef roasted as ever knife was put into, with potatoes, horseradish, pickled walnuts, etc., which his highness might have eaten, if so he had pleased to do. Along with the political intelligence and the letters, the Gazette also contains these notices and stock quotations. Marriages, none since our last, but puss begins to go a-courting. Deaths in the back closet and elsewhere, many poor mice. Stocks, biscuit, very low. Buckwheat and Indian meal, both sour. Tea, lowering daily. In the canister, wine shut. The petition of the letter Z was a humorous offshoot of Franklin's reformed alphabet, in a formal complaint after the manner of a bill in Chancery to the worshipful Isaac Bickerstaff, Esquire. Censor General Z complains that his claims to respect are as good as those of the other letters of the alphabet, but that he had not only been placed at its tail, when he had as much right as any of his companions to be at its head, but by the injustice of his enemies had been totally excluded from the word wise, and his place filled by a little hissing, crooked, serpentine, venomous letter called S, though it must be evident to his worship and to all the world that W-I-S-E does not spell wise, but W-I-S-E. The petition ends with the prayer that in consideration of his long-suffering patience, the petitioner may be placed at the head of the alphabet, and that S may be turned out of the word wise, and the petitioner employed instead of him. Z did not make out his case, for at the foot of the petition it is appended this order: Mr. Bickerstaff, having examined the allegations of the above petition, judges and determines that Z be admonished to be content with his station, forbear reflections upon his brother letters, and remember his own small usefulness, and the little occasion there is for him in the republic of letters, since S, whom he so despises, can so well serve instead of him. End of section 30. Section 31 of Benjamin Franklin, Self-Revealed, Volume 2 by William Bruce. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5, Part 4, Franklin as a Writer. Some of the liveliest of the lighter papers of Franklin were written during the course of his French mission. His inimitable journey to the Elysian fields and Kant have already received our attention, and an earlier chapter, among the others, was the sale of the Hessians, the supplement to the Boston Independent Chronicle, the Ephemera, the Whistle, his letter to the Abbé de la Roche, communicating to him the Petite Chanson à boire that he had written 40 years before, his letter to the Abbé Morellet on wine, the dialogue between him and the gout, the handsome and deformed leg, and the economical project. If there was nothing else to support the claim of Franklin to the authorship of The Sale of the Hessians, the difficulty of abridging it would be one proof. Its humour is as trenchant as that of Frederick the Great in levying the same toll upon these hirelings when passing through his dominions on their way to America, pursuant to the mercenary engagements between their German masters and George the Third, as that levied by him upon other cattle. The paper is thrown into the form of a letter from the Count de Schomberg to the Baron Hohendorf, commanding the Hessian troops in America. It begins as follows. Monsieur de Baron, on my return from Naples, I received at Rome your letter of the 27th December of last year. I've learned with unspeakable pleasure the courage our troops exhibited at Trenton, and you cannot imagine my joy on being told that of the 1,950 Hessians engaged in the fight, but 345 escaped. There were just 1,605 men killed, and I cannot sufficiently commend your prudence in sending an exact list of the dead to my minister in London. This precaution was the more necessary as the report sent to the English ministry does not give but 1,455 dead. This would make 483,450 florins instead of 643,500, which I am entitled to demand under our convention. You will comprehend the prejudice with such an error would work in my finances, and I do not doubt you will take the necessary pains to prove that Lord North's list is false and yours correct. This is another paragraph. I'm about to send to you some new recruits. Don't economize them. Remember glory before all things. Glory is true wealth. There is nothing degrades the soldier like the love of money. He must care only for honor and reputation, but this reputation must be acquired in the midst of dangers. A battle gained without costing the conqueror any blood is an inglorious success, while the conquered cover themselves with glory by perishing with their arms in their hands. Do you remember that of the 300 Lacedaemonians who defended the defile of Thermopylae, not one returned? How happy should I be could I say the same of my brave Hessians! It is true that their king, Leonidas, perished with them, but things have changed, and it is no longer the custom for princes of the empire to go and fight in America for the cause with which they have no concern. The baron is further commended for sending back to Europe that Dr. Crumeris, who was so successful in curing dysentery, and is told that it is better that the Hessians should burst in their barracks than fly in a battle and tarnish the glory of the Count's arms. Besides, the Count continues, you know that they pay meat as killed for all who die from disease, and I don't get a farthing for runaways. My trip to Italy, which has cost me enormously, makes it desirable that there should be a great mortality among them. You will therefore promise promotion to all who expose themselves. You will exhort them to seek glory in the midst of dangers. You will say to Major Mondorf that I am not at all content with his saving the 345 men who escaped the massacre of Trenton. Through the whole campaign he has not had 10 men killed in consequence of his orders. Finally, let it be your principal object to prolong the war and avoid a decisive engagement on either side, for I have made arrangements for a grand Italian opera, and I do not wish to be obliged to give it up. Meantime, I pray God, my dear Baron de Hohendorf, to have you in his holy and gracious keeping. The supplement to the Boston Independent Chronicle is distinguished by the same sort of cool, dry, mocking verisimilitude. Captain Garish of the New England militia is supposed to write a letter in which he says that the members of a recent expedition against the Indians were struck with horror to find among the packages of peltry captured by them 8 large ones containing scalps of their unhappy country folks taken in the last 3 years by the Seneca Indians from the heads of inhabitants of frontiers of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, and sent by them as a present to Colonel Haldimand, the governor of Canada, to be forwarded by him to England. The scalps, Captain Garish asserts, were accompanied by a curious letter to the governor from one James Crawford. Then is set forth this letter, which describes with the minuteness of a mercantile invoice the contents of each of the 8 packages of scalps, some of Congress soldiers, some of farmers surprised in their houses at night, some of farmers killed in their houses by day, some of farmers killed in the fields, some of women, some of boys, some of girls, and some of little infants ripped from the womb. The contents of several of the packages are described as mixed lots. The letter also fully explains the Indian triumphal marks painted upon the different scalps, which were all cured, dried, and stretched like the pelts of the otter or beaver on hoops. The black circle denoted that the victim had perished at night, the little red foot that he had died in defense of his life and family, the little yellow flame that he had been tortured at the stake. The hair, braided in the Indian fashion, meant that the victim was a mother, other tokens that the victim was a boy or a girl. A band fixed to the hoop of one of the scalps signified that the head to which it had been attached was that of a rebel clergyman. Many gruesome tokens are explained in the same systematic and business-like manner, along with several other passages from a speech of Kona Jogachi in council. The letter also communicates one in which the speaker declares that his people wish the scalps to be sent across the water to the great king, that he might regard them and be refreshed. In concluding his own letter, Captain Garish states that Lieutenant Fitzgerald would have undertaken to convey the scalps to England and to hang them all up some dark night on the trees in St. James's Park, where they could be seen from the King and Queen's palaces in the morning. But this proposal, the Chronicle says, was not approved in Boston. It was proposed instead to make the scalps up in decent little packets, and to seal and direct them, one to the king containing a sample of every kind for his museum, one to the queen with some of women and children, the rest to be distributed among both houses of Parliament, and a double quantity to be given to the bishops. The relations of the Chronicle to this production were, of course, as purely fictitious as every other part of it. Associated with the performance as another publication in the Chronicle is a fictitious letter, too, from Paul Jones to Sir Joseph Yorke, the English ambassador to Holland, in which he defends himself with considerable spirit from the charge of being a pirate, and reminds Sir Joseph of the freebooting principles upon which England was waging war against America. When he read this letter, Horace Walpole wrote to the Countess of Ossory, "Have you seen in the papers an excellent letter of Paul Jones to Sir Joseph Yorke? Elle nous dit bien des vérités." I doubt poor Sir Joseph cannot answer them. Dr. Franklin himself, I should think, was the author. It is certainly written by a first-rate pen, and not by a common man of war. The ephemera was addressed to Madame Brillon, and is one of the most justly famous of all Franklin's writings. In a letter to William Carmichael, he states that the thought was partly taken from a little piece of some unknown writer, which he had met with 50 years before in a newspaper. Another proof, we might say in passing, how little disposed Franklin was to borrow from Richard Jackson or any one else without due acknowledgment. So dependent is every part of this paper for its effect upon the whole, that to quote only a portion of it would be as futile as an effort to divide a bubble without destroying it. These are the precise words in full of this bewitching little production. You may remember, my dear friend, that when we lately spent that happy day in the delightful garden and sweet society, the Moulin Joly, I stopped a little in one of our walks, and stayed some time behind the company. We had been shown numberless skeletons of a kind of little fly called ephemera, whose successive generations, we were told, were bred and expired within the day. I happened to see a living company of them on a leaf, who appeared to be engaged in conversation. You know I understand all the inferior animal tongues. My too great application to the study of them is the best excuse I can give for the little progress I've made in your charming language. I listened through curiosity to the discourse of these little creatures, but as they, in their national vivacity, spoke 3 or 4 together, I could make but little of their conversation. I found, however, by some broken expressions that I had heard, now and then they were disputing warmly on the merit of 2 foreign musicians, one of cousin to the other of Moscheto, in which dispute they spent their time seemingly as regardless of the shortness of life as if they had been sure of living a month. Happy people, thought I, you are certainly under a wise, just, and mild government, since you have no public grievances to complain of, nor any subject of contention but the perfections and imperfections of foreign music. I turned my head from them to an old grey-headed one, who was single on another leaf and talking to himself. Being amused with this soliloquy, I put it down in writing, in hopes it will likewise amuse her to whom I am so much indebted for the most pleasing of all amusements, her delicious company and heavenly harmony. It was, said he, the opinion of learned philosophers of our race, who lived and flourished long before my time, that this vast world, the Moulin Joly, could not itself subsist more than 18 hours. And I think there was some foundation for that opinion, since by the apparent motion of the great luminary that gives life to all nature, and which in my time has evidently declined considerably towards the ocean at the end of our earth, it must then finish its course, extinguished in the waters that surround us, and leave the world in cold and darkness, necessarily producing universal death and destruction. I've lived 7 of those hours, a great age, being no less than 420 minutes of time. How very few of us continue so long. I've seen generations born, flourish, and expire. My present friends are the children and grandchildren of the friends of my youth, who are now, alas, no more. And I must soon follow them, for by the course of nature, though still in health, I cannot expect to live above 7 or 8 minutes longer. What now avails all my toil and labour in amassing honey-dew on this leaf, which I cannot live to enjoy? What the political struggles I have been engaged in for the good of my compatriot inhabitants of this bush, or my philosophical studies for the benefit of our race in general? For in politics what can laws do without morals? Our present race of ephemerae will in a course of minutes become corrupt like those of other and older bushes, and consequently as wretched. And in philosophy how small our progress! Alas, art is long and life is short. My friends would comfort me with the idea of a name they say I shall leave behind me, and they tell me I've lived long enough to nature and to glory. But what will fame be to an ephemera who no longer exists, and what will become of all history in the 18th hour, when the world itself, even the whole Moulin Joly, shall come to its end and be buried in universal ruin? To me, after all my eager pursuits, no solid pleasures now remain, but the reflection of a long life spent in meaning well, the sensible conversation of a few good lady ephemerae, and now and then a kind smile and a tune from the ever amiable Briand. The whistle, too, was addressed to Madame Briand, and is also one of the most celebrated of Franklin's bagatelles, but is scarcely equal, we think, to the best of them. In his opinion, Franklin said they might all draw more good from the world than they did if they would take care not to give too much for whistles. With this forward he tells his story. When a child of 7 years of age, his friends on a holiday filled his pocket with coppers, and being charmed with the sound of a whistle that he met by the way in the hands of another boy, he voluntarily offered and gave all his money for one. He then came home, and went whistling all over the house, much pleased with his whistle, but disturbing the entire family. But his brothers and sisters told him that he had given 4 times as much for the whistle as it was worth, put him in mind of what good things he might have bought with the rest of the money, and laughed at him so much for his folly that he cried with vexation. The lesson, however, was of use to him, so that often, when he was tempted to buy some unnecessary thing, he said to himself, "Don't give too much for the whistle," and he saved his money. And so when he grew up, came into the world, and observed the actions of men, he thought he met with many, very many, who gave too much for the whistle. He then mentions who some of these men were: the man ambitious of court favor, the man covetous of political popularity, the miser, the slave of pleasure, the devotee of fashion, the beautiful, sweet-tempered girl, married to an ill-natured brute of a husband, and after the mention of each comes the running comment, "This man gives too much for his whistle," or its equivalent. Yet Franklin concludes, "I ought to have charity for these unhappy people, when I consider that with all this wisdom of which I am boasting, there are certain things in the world so tempting, for example, the apples of King John, which happily are not to be bought, for if they were put to sale by auction, I might very easily be led to ruin myself in the purchase, and find that I had once more given too much for the whistle." The reader has already had occasion to know what kind of fruit these apples of King John were, and in whose orchard they grew, to realize what an indifferent poet Franklin was, and yet at the same time what a master of prose. One has but to first read his Petite Chanson à boire, beginning "Fair Venus calls, her voice obey," and then his letter to the Abbé Morellet on wine. The letter was written to repay the abbé for some of his excellent drinking songs. "In vino veritas," said the sage, is the way Franklin begins. Before Noah, when men had nothing but water to drink, they could not find the truth, so they went astray and became abominably wicked, and were justly exterminated by the water that they were fond of drinking. Good man Noah, seeing that this bad drink had been the death of all his contemporaries, contracted an aversion to it, and God, to quench his thirst, created the vine, and revealed to him the art of making wine. With its aid Noah discovered many and many a truth, and since his time the word divine has been in use, meaning originally to discover by means of wine. Since that time, too, all excellent things, even deities themselves, have been called divine or divinities. Men speak of the conversion of water into wine at the marriage of Cana as a miracle, but this change is worked every day by the goodness of God under our eyes. Witness the water that falls from the skies upon our vineyards, and that passes into the roots of the vines to be converted into wine, a constant proof that God loves us, and that he is pleased to see us happy. The miracle in question was performed merely to hasten the operation on an occasion of sudden need that made it indispensable. It is true that God has also taught men how to reduce wine to water, But what kind of water? Why, l'eau de vie. Franklin then begs his Christian brother to be kindly and beneficent like God, and not to spoil his good work. When he saw his table companion pour wine into his glass, he should not hasten to pour water into it. Why should he desire to drown the truth? His neighbor was likely to know better what suited him than he. Perhaps he does not like water. Perhaps he wishes only a few drops of it out of complaisance to the fashion of the day. Perhaps he does not wish another to see how little he puts in his glass. Water then should be offered only to children. It was a false and annoying form of politeness to do otherwise. This the writer told the abbé as a man of the world, and he would end as he had begun, like a good Christian, by making one very important religious observation suggested by the Holy Scriptures. While the Apostle Paul had gravely advised Timothy to put wine into his water for his health, not one of the apostles nor any of the Holy Fathers had ever advised anyone to put water into wine. The dialogue between Franklin and the gout owes its value not so much to its humor as to the knowledge that it incidentally affords us of the personal habits of the former and his intimacy with Madame Helvetius and Madame Brillon. Along with the reproaches and twinges of pain which evoke repeated A's and O's from Franklin as the colloquy proceeds, the gout contrives to communicate to us no little information on these subjects in terms in which physiology, hygiene, and gallantry are each made to do duty. He tells Franklin that he, the gout, very well knows that the quantity of meat and drink proper for a man who takes a reasonable degree of exercise is too much for another who never takes any. If his Franklin's situation in life is a sedentary one, his amusements and recreations at least should be active. He ought to walk or ride, or if the weather prevents, that play at billiards, but instead of gaining an appetite for breakfast by salutary exercise, he amuses himself with books, pamphlets, or newspapers which commonly are not worth the reading. Yet he eats an inordinate breakfast, 4 dishes of tea with cream, and 1 or 2 buttered toasts with slices of hung beef, which the gout fancies are not things the most easily digested. Immediately afterwards he sits down to write at his desk or converse with persons who apply to him on business. Thus the time passes till one without any kind of bodily exercise. This might be pardoned out of regard, as Franklin said, for his sedentary condition, but what is his practice after dinner? Walking in the beautiful gardens of those friends with whom he had dined would be the choice of men of sense. His was to be fixed down to chess, where he was found, engaged for 2 or 3 hours. This was his perpetual recreation, which was the least eligible of any for a sedentary man, because instead of accelerating the motion of the fluids, the rigid attention it required helped to retard the circulation and obstruct internal secretions. Wrapped in the speculations of this wretched game, he destroyed his constitution. What could be expected from such a course of living but a body replete with stagnant humours, ready to fall a prey to all kinds of dangerous maladies, if he, the gout, did not occasionally bring him relief by agitating those humours, and so purifying or dissipating them? If it was in some nook or alley in Paris, deprived of walks, that Franklin played a while at chess after dinner, this might be excusable, but the same taste prevailed with him in Paris, at Auteuil, Montmartre, or Sanois, places where there were the finest gardens and walks, of pure air, beautiful women, and most agreeable and instructive conversation, all of which he might enjoy by frequenting the walks. At this point Franklin, after some more prolonged A's and O's, manages to remind the gout that it is not fair to say that he takes no exercise, when he does so very often in going out to dine and returning in his carriage. But this statement the gout brushes brusquely aside. That of all imaginable exercises he asserts is the most slight and insignificant. If Franklin alludes to the motion of a carriage suspended on springs, by observing the degree of heat obtained by different kinds of motion, we may form an estimate of the quantity of exercise given by each. Thus, for example, if Franklin should turn out to walk in winter with cold feet in an hour's time, he would be in a glow all over. If he should ride on horseback, the same effect would scarcely be perceived by 4 hours round trotting. But if he should loll in a carriage, such as he had mentioned, he might travel all day, and gladly enter the last inn to warm his feet by a fire. Providence has appointed few to roll in carriages, while it has given to all a pair of legs, which are machines infinitely more commodious and serviceable. He should observe when he walked that all his weight was alternately thrown from one leg to the other. This occasions a great pressure upon the vessels of the foot, and repels their contents. When relieved by the weight being thrown on the other foot, the vessels of the first are allowed to replenish, and by a return of this weight this repulsion again succeeds, thus accelerating the circulation of the blood, with the result that the cheeks are ruddy and the health established. Behold, the gout is then artfully made to say, your fair friend at Artuia, Madame Helvetius, a lady who received from bounteous nature more really useful science than half a dozen such pretenders to philosophy as you have been able to extract from all your books. When she honours you with a visit, it is on foot. She walks all hours of the day, and leaves indolence and its concomitant maladies to be endured by her horses. In this see at once the preservative of her health and personal charms. Nor does the gout go off before he is with equal art made to say a flattering word about the Brillons. You know, he declares, Monsieur Brillon's gardens, and what fine walks they contain. You know the handsome flight of 100 steps which lead from the terrace above to the lawn below. You have been in the practice of visiting this amiable family twice a week after dinner, and it is a maxim of your own that a man may take as much exercise in walking a mile up and down stairs as in 10 on level ground. What an opportunity was here for you to have had exercise in both these ways. Did you embrace it, and how often? Franklin is bound to admit that he cannot immediately answer the question, and the gout answers it for him. Not once, he says, and then goes on to chide Franklin with the fact that during the summer he is in the habit of going to Monsieur Brillon's at 6 o'clock, and contenting himself with the view from his terrace, tea, and the chessboard, though the charming lady, with her lovely children and friends, are eager to walk with him and entertain him with their agreeable conversation. A little more interchange of conversation, and poor Franklin, in despair, asks, What then would you have me do with my carriage? And the gout replies, Burn it, if you choose. You would at least get heat out of it once in this way. In the end, Franklin promises that if his persecutor will only leave him, he will never more play at chess, but will take exercise daily and live temperately, a promise the gout tells him that with a few months of good health will be forgotten like the forms of last year's clouds. The handsome and deformed leg divides the world into two classes: the happy who fix their eyes on the bright side of things and enjoy everything, and the unhappy who fix their eyes on the dark side of things and criticize everything, and thereby render themselves completely odious. An old philosophical friend of his, Franklin said, carefully avoided any intimacy with the latter class of people. He had, like other philosophers, a thermometer to show him the heat of the weather, and a barometer to mark when it was likely to prove good or bad. But there being no instrument invented to discern at first sight whether a person had their unpleasant disposition, he for that purpose made use of his legs, one of which was remarkably handsome, and the other, by some accident, crooked and deformed. If a stranger at the first interview regarded his ugly leg more than his handsome one, he doubted him. If he spoke of it and took no notice of the handsome leg, that was sufficient to determine this philosopher to have no further acquaintance with him. Everybody concludes Franklin has not this two-legged instrument, but everyone with a literal attention may observe signs of that carping, fault-finding disposition, and take the same resolution of avoiding the acquaintance of those infected with it. I therefore advise those critical, querulous, discontented, unhappy people, that if they wish to be respected and beloved by others and happy in themselves, they should leave off looking at the ugly leg. The economical project is a happy combination of humor and prudential instruction, and was written about the time when the quinquet lamp was an object of general public curiosity. An inquiry having been started on one occasion in his presence, Franklin says as to whether its brightness was not offset by its lavish consumption of oil, he went home and to bed 3 or 4 hours after midnight, with his head full of the subject. At about 6 in the morning he was awakened by a noise, and was surprised to find his room full of light. At first he imagined that he was surrounded by a number of quinquet lamps, but on rubbing his eyes he perceived that the light came in at the windows, and when he got up and looked out to see what caused it, he saw the sun just rising above the horizon. His servant had forgotten the preceding evening to close the shutters. Looking at his watch and finding that it was but 6 o'clock, and still thinking it something extraordinary that the sun should rise so early, he consulted an almanac and ascertained that it was just the hour for sunrise on that day, and moreover he learned from the almanac that the sun would rise still earlier every day till towards the end of June. His readers, he was sure, would be as much astonished as he was when they heard that the sun rises so early, and especially when he assured them that it gives light as soon as it rises. He was convinced of this. He was certain of this fact. One could not be more certain of any fact. On repeating his observation the 3 following mornings, he found always precisely the same result. Yet when he spoke of the matter, it was to incredulous countenances. One auditor, a learned natural philosopher, assured him that he must certainly be mistaken as to the light coming into his room, for it being well known that there could be no light abroad at that hour, it followed that none could enter from without, and that of consequence his open windows, instead of letting in the light, must have only served to let out the darkness. This philosopher, Franklin confessed, puzzled him a little, but subsequent observation confirmed him in his first opinion. On the strength of these facts, Franklin enters upon a series of elaborate calculations to demonstrate that between the 20th of March and the 20th of September, the Parisians, because of their habit of preferring candlelight in the evening to sunlight in the morning, had consumed 64,050,000 pounds of candles, which at an average price of 30 sols per pound made 96,076,000 livres tournois. An immense sum that the city of Paris might save every year by the economy of using sunshine instead of candles, to say nothing of the period of the year during which the days are shorter. This computation is succeeded by a number of suggestions as to the different means by which such of the Parisians as did not amend their hours upon learning from this paper that it is daylight when the sun rises could be induced to reform their habits. For his discovery, Franklin further said that he demanded neither place, pension, exclusive privilege, nor any other reward whatever. He was looking only to the honor of it. He would not deny, when he was assailed by little envious minds, that the ancients knew that the sun rises at certain hours. They too possibly had almanacs, but it does not follow that they knew that it gives light as soon as it rises. That was what he claimed as his discovery. It was certainly unknown to the moderns, at least to the Parisians, which to prove he need use but one plain simple argument. It was impossible that a people as well instructed, judicious, and prudent as any in the world, all professing to be lovers of economy and subject to onerous taxation, should have lived so long by the smoky, unwholesome, and enormously expensive light of candles, if they had really known that they might have as much pure light of the sun for nothing. A letter from China, in which a sailor who had passed some time in that country is made to narrate in a simple, bald way what he saw and experienced while there, is worth reading, if only because of the evidence that it furnishes that almost every trifle from Franklin's pen has a certain literary quality. One sentence in the letter, at any rate, possesses the true Franklin flavor, that in which the wanderer states that in China stealing, robbing, and housebreaking are punished severely, but that cheating is free there in everything, as cheating in horses is among gentlemen in England. Other humorous or satirical compositions from the hand of Franklin belong to the period between his return from the French mission and his death. His letter to the Pennsylvania Gazette on the abuse of the press deprecates in a familiar and jocular way the scurrilous license which marked the newspaper controversies of the time. After recalling insulting epithets heaped upon other public servants, he mentions that he, too, the unanimous choice as president of the Council and Assembly of Pennsylvania, had been denounced as an old rogue who had given his assent to the federal Constitution merely to avoid the refunding of money that he had purloined from the United States. There is, indeed, the letter ends, a good deal of manifest inconsistency in all this, and yet a stranger seeing it in your own prints, though he does not believe it all, may probably believe enough of it to conclude that Pennsylvania is peopled by a set of the most unprincipled, wicked, rascally, and quarrelsome scoundrels upon the face of the globe. I've sometimes indeed suspected that those papers are the manufacture of foreign enemies among you, who write with a view of disgracing your country and making you appear contemptible and detestable all the world over. But then I wonder at the indiscretion of your printers in publishing such writings. There is, however, one of your inconsistencies that consoles me a little, which is that though living, you give one another the characters of devils. Dead, you are all angels. It is delightful, when any of you die, to read what good husbands, good fathers, good friends, good citizens, and good Christians you were, concluding with a scrap of poetry that places you, with certainty, every one in heaven, so that I think Pennsylvania a good country to die in, though a very bad one to live in. The comparison of the conduct of the ancient Jews and of the anti-federalists in the United States of America belongs to the same category as plain truth, rather than to the class of writings which Franklin termed bagatelles. The parallel, however, between the jealousy worked upon by insidious men pretending public good, but with nothing really in view except private interest, which led the Israelites to oppose the establishment of the new Constitution after the flight from Egypt, and the hostility of the anti-federalists to work of the Convention of 1787, is pursued with such cleverness as to lift it out of the province of the ordinary newspaper essay. There is an unwonted strain of solemnity in its last sentences. To conclude, Franklin declares, I beg I may not be understood to infer that our General Convention was divinely inspired when it formed the new Federal Constitution, merely because that Constitution has been unreasonably and vehemently opposed. Yet I must own I have so much faith in the general government of the world by Providence that I can hardly conceive a transaction of such momentous importance to the welfare of millions now existing, and to exist in the posterity of a great nation, should be suffered to pass without being in some degree influenced, guided, and governed by that omnipotent, omnipresent, and beneficent ruler, in whom all inferior spirits live and move and have their being. Of the account of the supremest court of judicature in Pennsylvania, viz., the court of the press, in which Franklin suggested that formal cognizance should be taken of the cudgel as well as of the liberty of the press, we have already said enough. The pretended speech of Sidi Mehemet Ibrahim, a member of the Divan of Algiers, against the petition of the Ivriga or purists, asking that piracy and slavery be abolished, was written by him on the eve of his death, and is one of his best satirical thrusts. It was a parody on a speech that had been lately delivered in Congress in defense of Negro slavery by Mr. Jackson of Georgia, and its wit consists in the art with which it implicitly urges, in justification of the Algerian practice of plundering and enslaving Christians, all the considerations urged by Jackson in his plea for African slavery. In his letter conveying Sidi's speech to the Federal Gazette, Franklin states that it might be found in Martin's account of the former's consulship anno 1687, and we are told that this statement caused many persons to apply to bookstores and libraries for Martin's supposed work. Then as now there could be no better means for determining how matter-of-fact a person was than to test his sense of humor with one of Franklin's facetious cheats. The exact time at which the petition of the left hand to those who have the superintendency of education was written is unknown. Its motive is not unlike that of the petition of the letter Z. It complains that from infancy the petitioner had been led to consider her sister as a being of more elevated rank. She had been suffered to grow up without the least instruction, while nothing was spared in the education of the latter, who had had masters to teach her writing, drawing, music, and other accomplishments. If by chance the petitioner touched a pencil, a pen, or a needle, she was bitterly rebuked, and more than once had been beaten for being awkward and wanting a graceful manner. But conceive not, sirs, says the left hand further, that my complaints are instigated merely by vanity. No, my uneasiness is occasioned by an object much more serious. It is the practice in our family that the whole business of providing for its subsistence falls upon my sister and myself. If any indisposition should attack my sister, and I mention it in confidence upon this occasion, that she is subject to the gout, the rheumatism, and cramp, without making mention of other accidents, what would be the fate of our poor family? Must not the regret of our parents be excessive at having placed so great a difference between sisters who are so perfectly equal? Alas, we must perish from distress, for it would not be in my power even to scrawl a suppliant petition for relief, having been obliged to employ the hand of another in transcribing the request which I have now the honour to prefer to you. End of section 31. Section 32 of Benjamin Franklin, Self-Revealed, Volume 2, by William Bruce. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5, Part 5, Franklin as a Writer. One of the essays of Franklin is an essay which he termed a bagatelle, but which is of a different cast from most of his papers bearing that designation. This is the essay on the morals of chess. As a mere literary production, it possesses remarkable merit, but it is more valuable still for the singular union of wisdom and benevolence found in all of the writer's precepts relating to the conduct of life. It is only upon the contracted face of an ordinary chessboard that the sagacious reflections and salutary counsels of this paper are based, but many of them are quite extensive enough in their application to be suitable for the morals of the wider chessboard, on which men and women themselves are the pawns, and the universal currents of human nature and human existence the players. By playing at chess, Franklin thought we may learn foresight, circumspection, caution, and hopefulness. When playing it, if the agreement is that the rules of the game shall be strictly observed, they should be strictly observed by both parties. If the agreement is that they shall not be strictly observed, one party should claim no indulgence for himself that he is not willing to grant to his adversary. No false move should ever be made by a player to extricate himself from a difficulty or to gain an advantage. There can be no pleasure in playing with a person once detected in such an unfair practice. If your adversary is long in playing, you should not hurry him or express any uneasiness at his delay, nor sing, nor whistle, nor look at your watch, nor take up a book to read, nor tap with your feet on the floor, or with your fingers on the table, nor do anything that may disturb his attention. For all these things displease, and they do not show your skill in playing, but your craftiness or your rudeness. You should not endeavor to amuse and deceive your adversary by pretending to have made bad moves in order to render him confident and careless and inattentive to your schemes. This is fraud and deceit, not skill. If you gain the victory, you should not give way to exultation or insult, nor show too much pleasure. On the contrary, you should endeavor to console your adversary and soothe his wounded pride by every sort of civil expression that may be used with truth, such as "You understand the game better than I, but you are a little inattentive," or "You played too fast," or "You had the best of the game, but something happened to divert your thoughts, and that turned it in my favor." If you are simply a spectator, you should observe the most perfect silence, for if you give advice, you offend both parties, him against whom you give it, because it may cause the loss of his game, him in whose favor you give it, because, though it be good, and he follows it, he loses the pleasure he might have had if you had permitted him to think until it had occurred to himself. And thus this essay, so full of wholesome, kind advice from a counselor who loved men none the less because he knew all their failings and foibles as well as virtues, continues a little longer, until the reader, already won over to its perfect rectitude of sentiment and purpose, entirely forgets how obvious are all the truisms of its stating that he has so often offended. The measure of self-abnegation suggested by the conclusion of the essay is, we fear, rather too exacting for the tug of chessboard selfishness upon the weaker side of human nature. If it is agreed that the rules of the game are not to be rigorously enforced, then, says Franklin, moderate your desire of victory over your adversary, and be pleased with one over yourself. Do not snatch eagerly at every advantage offered by his unskilfulness or inattention, but point out to him kindly that by such a move he places or leaves a piece in danger and unsupported, or that by another he will put his king in a perilous situation, etc. By this generous civility, so opposite to the unfairness above forbidden, you may indeed happen to lose the game to your opponent, the close of the essay declares, but you will win what is better, his esteem, his respect, and his affection, together with the silent approbation and goodwill of impartial spectators. We shall not linger upon the letters of Franklin. The substance of them has already been worked into this book too freely for that. It is sufficient to say that they are among the very best in the English language. It would be idle to compare them with those of Gray, Horace Walpole, Cowper, Byron, or Fitzgerald, the acknowledged masters of that form of composition. Franklin was not a conscious man of letters at all, and is not to be judged by such academic standards. If he was, we might say that Cowper aerated with a little of Walpole most nearly, though, after all, but remotely, suggests a true conception of what Franklin was as a letter writer. Few men were ever saner than Cowper was during his really lucid intervals. But then Cowper was not a man of business, a statesman or a philosopher, and the elixir of Walpole's gaiety differs from that of Franklin's, as a stimulant of the wine-shop differs from fresh air and sunshine. The official and semi-official letters of Franklin contain some of the most solid and sagacious of his reflections and observations on political topics. His familiar letters to his kinsfolk and friends often run out into thoughts upon the management of our individual lives and our relations to the visible and invisible universe, which are likely to be a part of the currency of human wisdom as long as human society lasts. And almost all of his known letters have value enough to make us feel when still another of the thousands written by him happens to be reclaimed from loss, as Reuben in his parable might have felt if he had recovered his precious axe. Among the cleverest of his letters was his familiar one to his daughter on the Order of the Cincinnati. If his advice had been asked, he said he perhaps would not have objected to their wearing their ribbon and badge themselves, if they derived pleasure from such trivial things, but he certainly should have objected to the idea of making the honour hereditary. And this was the amusing and original way in which he presented his views on the subject. For honour worthily obtained, as for example that of our officers, is in its nature a personal thing, and incommunicable to any but those who had some share in obtaining it. Thus among the Chinese, the most ancient, and from long experience the wisest of nations, honour does not descend, but ascends. If a man from his learning, his wisdom, or his valour is promoted by the emperor to the rank of mandarin, his parents are immediately entitled to all the same ceremonies of respect from the people that are established as due to the mandarin himself, on the supposition that it must have been owing to the education, instruction, and good example afforded him by his parents, that he was rendered capable of serving the public. This ascending honor is therefore useful to the state, as it encourages parents to give their children a good and virtuous education. But the descending honor to posterity, who could have no share in obtaining it, is not only groundless and absurd, but often hurtful to that posterity, since it is apt to make them proud, disdaining to be employed in useful arts, and thence falling into poverty and all the meannesses, servility, and wretchedness attending it, which is the present case with much of what is called the noblesse in Europe. Or if, to keep up the dignity of the family, estates are entailed entire on the eldest male heir, another pest to industry and improvement of the country is introduced, which will be followed by all the odious mixture of pride and beggary and idleness that have half depopulated and decultivated Spain, occasioning continual extinction of families by the discouragements of marriage and neglect in the improvement of estates. I wish, therefore, that the Cincinnati, if they must go on with their project, would direct the badges of their order to be worn by their parents instead of handing them down to their children. It would be a good precedent and might have good effects. It would also be a kind of obedience to the fourth commandment, in which God enjoins us to honor our father and mother, but has nowhere directed us to honor our children. And certainly no mode of honoring those immediate authors of our being can be more effectual than that of doing praiseworthy actions which reflect honor on those who gave us our education, or more becoming than that of manifesting by some public expression or token that it is to their instruction and example we ascribe the merit of those actions. But the absurdity of descending honors is not a mere matter of philosophical opinion. It is capable of mathematical demonstration. A man's son, for instance, is but half of his family, the other half belonging to the family of his wife. His son, too, marrying into another family, his share in the grandson is but a fourth. In the great-grandson, by the same process, it is but an eighth. In the next generation, a 16th, the next a 32nd, the next a 64th, the next 128th, the next a 256th, and the next 512th, thus in 9 generations, which will not require more than 300 years, no very great antiquity for a family. Our present Chevalier of the Order of Cincinnatus's share in the then existing knight will be but a 512th part, which, allowing the present certain fidelity of American wives to be ensured down through all those 9 generations, is so small a consideration that methinks no reasonable man would hazard, for the sake of it, the disagreeable consequences of the jealousy, envy, and ill will of his countrymen. Let us go back with our calculation from this young noble, the 512th part of the present knight, through his 9 generations, till we return to the year of the institution. He must have had a father and mother. They are 2. Each of them had a father and mother. They are 4. Those of the next preceding generation will be 8. The next 16. The next 32. The next 64, the next 128, the next 256, and the 9th in this retrocession 512, who must be now existing, and all contribute their proportion of this future Chevalier de Cincinnatus. These with the rest make together as follows: 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, adds up to 1022. Men and women, contributors to the formation of one knight, and if we are to have 1,000 of these future knights, there must be now and hereafter existing 1,022,000 fathers and mothers who are to contribute to their production, unless a part of the number are employed in making more knights than one. Let us strike off then the 22,000 on the supposition of this double employ, and then consider whether, after a reasonable estimation of the number of rogues and fools and royalists and scoundrels and prostitutes that are mixed with and help to make up necessarily their million of predecessors, posterity will have much reason to boast of the noble blood of the then existing set of Chevaliers de Cincinnatus. The future genealogists, too, of these chevaliers, in proving the lineal descent of their honour through so many generations, even supposing honour capable in its nature of descending, will only prove the small share of this honour which can be justly claimed by any one of them, since the above simple process in arithmetic makes it quite plain and clear that in proportion as the antiquity of the family shall augment, the right to the honour of the ancestor will diminish, and a few generations more would reduce it to something so small as to be very near an absolute nullity. I hope, therefore, that the order will drop this part of their project and content themselves, as the Knights of the Garter, Bath, Thistle, St. Louis, and other orders of Europe do, with the life enjoyment of their little badge and ribbon, and let the distinction die with those who have merited it. This, I imagine, will give no offence. For my own part, I shall think it a convenience when I go into a company where there may be faces unknown to me, if I discover by this badge the persons who merit some particular expression of my respect, and it will save modest virtue the trouble of calling for our regard by awkward roundabout intimations of having been heretofore employed in the continental service. The gentleman who made the voyage to France to provide the ribbons and medals has executed his commission. To me they seem tolerably done, but all such things are criticized. Some find fault with the Latin as wanting classic elegance and correctness, and since our 9 universities were not able to furnish better Latin, it was pity, they say, that the mottos had not been in English. Others object to the title as not properly assumable by any but General Washington and a few others who served without pay. Others object to the bald eagle as looking too much like a dindon or turkey. For my own part, I wish the bald eagle had not been chosen as the representative of our country. He is a bird of bad moral character. He does not get his living honestly. You may have seen him perched on some dead tree near the river, where, too lazy to fish for himself, he watches the labour of the fishing hawk, and when that diligent bird has at length taken a fish, and is bearing it to his nest for the support of his mate and young ones, the bald eagle pursues him and takes it from him. With all this injustice, he is never in good case, but like those among men who live by sharping and robbing, he is generally poor and often very lousy. Besides, he is a rank coward. The little king-bird, not bigger than a sparrow, attacks him boldly and drives him out of the district. He is therefore by no means a proper emblem for the brave and honest Cincinnati of America, who have driven all the king-birds from our country, though exactly fit for that order of knights which the French call chevaliers d'industrie. I am on this account not displeased that the figure is not known as a bald eagle, but looks more like a turkey. For in truth the turkey is in comparison a much more respectable bird, and withal a true original native of America. Eagles have been found in all countries, but the turkey was peculiar to ours, the first of the species seen in Europe being brought to France by the Jesuits from Canada and served up at the wedding table of Charles the Ninth. He is, though a little vain and silly, it is true, but not the worse emblem for that. A bird of courage, and would not hesitate to attack a grenadier of the British Guards who should presume to invade his farmyard with a red coat on. Nor need we dwell longer either upon Franklin as a poet. Considered seriously as such, he was undoubtedly one of the kind that, as Horace says, neither gods nor men can endure. But he should not be seriously regarded as a poet at all. We should bring no severer judgment to his couplets than was brought to them by the ploughmen and frontiersmen who kept Poor Ridge's almanac suspended over their mantelpieces, and his Anacreontics should be read as they were sung, after the edge of criticism has been dulled by a bottle or so. It is only fair to Poor Richard, however, to say that no one had a poorer opinion of his gifts as a poet than himself. "I know as thee," he says in one of his prefaces, "that I am no poet born, and it is a trade I never learnt, nor indeed could learn. If I make verses, 'tis in spite of nature and my stars I write." In another preface, after honouring his friend Taylor of Ephemerides fame with a considerable number of lines, he exclaims, "Soused down into prose again, my muse, for poetry's no more thy element than air is that of the flying fish." And we need go no further than one of Franklin's lively letters to Polly, at which we have already glanced, to satisfy ourselves that he placed quite as low an estimate on his verses as Poor Richard did on his. Speaking of the muse which he mentioned in his letters having visited him that morning, he observes in his light-hearted way, "This muse appeared to be no housewife. I suppose few of them are. She was dressed, if the expression is allowable, in an undress, a kind of slatternly negligee, neither neat nor clean, nor well made, and she has given the same sort of dress to my piece. On reviewing it, I would have reformed the lines and made them all of a length, as I am told lines ought to be. But I find I can't lengthen the short ones without stretching them on the rack, and I think it would be equally cruel to cut off any part of the long ones. Besides, the superfluity of these makes up for the deficiency of those, and so from a principle of justice I leave them at full length, that I may give you, at least in one sense of the word, good measure." Of all the productions of Franklin, the Autobiography and Poor Richard's Almanac are those upon which his literary fame will chiefly rest. Of the former we have already said too much to say much more about it. It is the only thing written by Franklin that can properly be called a book, and even if it is marked by the brevity which he regarded as one of the essentials of good writing. If he did not write other books, it was not, so far as we can see, because, as has been charged, he lacked constructive capacity, but rather because, when he resorted to the pen, he did not for literary celebrity, but for practical purposes of the hour, best served by brief essays or papers. It is true that in writing the early chapters of the Autobiography, which brought his life down to the year 1730, he was not exactly writing for the moment, but still the motive by which he was actuated was a purely practical one. "They were written to my son," he said in a letter to Matthew Carey, "and intended only as information to my family." Even in the later chapters which brought his life down to his 50th year, he still had a similar incentive to literary effort, highly congenial with the general bent of his character, that is to say, the opportunity that they afforded him to point to his business success as an example of what may be accomplished by frugality and industry. "What is to follow," he wrote to the Duc de la Rochefoucauld, "will be of more important transactions, but it seems to me that what is done will be of more general use to young readers as exemplifying strongly the effects of prudent and imprudent conduct in the commencement of a life of business." 2 days later he wrote to Benjamin Vaughan from Philadelphia that he was diligently employed in writing the Autobiography, to which his persuasions had not a little contributed. "To shorten the work," he said, "as well as for other reasons, I omit all facts and transactions that may not have a tendency to benefit the young reader by showing him from my example and my success in emerging from poverty and acquiring some degree of wealth, power, and reputation, the advantages of certain modes of conduct which I observed, and of avoiding the errors which were prejudicial to me." To the limited nature of the inducements to the composition of the Autobiography disclosed by these letters, it was due that the interest of Franklin in the subsequent continuation of the work was too languid for the completion of the whole plan of the Autobiography, as intimated in the hints which he gives of its intended scope, notwithstanding the urgent appeals which his friends never ceased to make to him to complete it. If one of the effects of the fearless self-arraignment of the autobiography has been to lower the standing of Franklin in some respects with posterity, we should remember the unselfish motive which induced him to turn his youthful errors to the profit of others, and also the fact that he had his own misgivings about the bearing upon his reputation of such outspoken self-exposure, and submitted the propriety of publishing the autobiography unreservedly to the judgment of friends who were certainly competent judges in every regard of what the moral sense of their time would approve. I am not without my doubts concerning the memoir, whether it would be proper to publish them or not. At least during my lifetime, he wrote to the Duc de la Rochefoucauld, and I am persuaded there are many things that would, in case of publication, be best omitted. I therefore requested most earnestly of you, my dear friend, that you would examine them carefully and critically with Monsieur le Bayard, and give me your candid and friendly advice thereupon as soon as you can conveniently. Later he wrote to Benjamin Vaughan from Philadelphia that he had of late been so interrupted by extreme pain, which obliged him to have recourse to opium, that between the effects of both he had but little time in which he could write anything, but that his grandson was copying what was done, which would be sent to Vaughan for his opinion by the next vessel. For he found it a difficult task to speak decently and properly of one's own conduct, and felt the want of a judicious friend to encourage him in scratching out. The next time that Franklin wrote to Vaughan, it was when opium alone could render existence tolerable to him, but in the interim he had happily discovered that he could dictate even when he could not write. What is already done, he said, I now send you with an earnest request that you and my good friend Dr. Price, later in the letter he calls him my dear Dr. Price, would be so good as to take the trouble of reading it, critically examining it, and giving me your candid opinion whether I had best publish or suppress it, and if the first, then what parts had better be expunged or altered. I shall rely upon your opinions, for I am now grown so old and feeble in mind as well as body that I cannot place any confidence in my own judgment. Of the same tenor was a still later letter to Monsieur le Bayard, in which Franklin expressed the hope that le Bayard would, with the Duc de la Rochefoucauld, read the memoirs over carefully, examine them critically, and send him his friendly, candid opinion of the parts that he would advise him to correct or expunge, in case he should think that the work was generally proper to be published, but if he judged otherwise, that he would inform him of that fact too, as soon as possible, and prevent him from incurring further trouble in the endeavour to finish the work. The world has reason to be thankful that the fate of the autobiography should thus have been left to the decision of men who, even if they had not lived in the 18th century, would have been robust enough in point of intelligence and morals to believe that the youthful errata laid bare in that book were more than atoned for by the manly and generous aims that inspired it. Of the autobiography, it is enough now to say that it is one of the few books which have arrested and permanently riveted the attention of the whole civilized world. Commenting in it on the copy of Pilgrim's Progress in Dutch, finely printed on good paper with copper cuts, which the drunken Dutchman whom he drew up by the shock pate from the waters of New York Bay on his first journey to Philadelphia handed to him to dry, Franklin says, I have since found that it has been translated into most of the languages of Europe, and suppose it has been more generally read than any other book, except perhaps the Bible. The autobiography is hardly less popular. It too has been translated into most of the languages of Europe, and has been printed and reprinted until it is one of the most widely read books in existence. Such it is likely to remain always, not simply because it was written by a very famous man who possessed, to an extraordinary degree, the power of impressing his thoughts and fancies on the hearts and imagination of the human race, but because it tells a story of self-conquest and self-promotion, full of warning, guidance, and hope for every human being who wishes to make the best of his own opportunities and powers. As a mere composition, dressed though it is like the poetic muse described by Franklin in his letter to Polly, in a kind of slatternly negligee, it is one of the masterpieces of literature. Its very careless loquacity is but suggestive of a mind overflowing with its own profusion of experience and reflection. There is no better test of the extent to which a writer has proved himself equal to the highest possibilities of his art than to ask how readily his conceptions can be pictured. For the mind of a great writer is but a gallery hung with such pictures as the painter reduces to material form and colour. Tried by this test, the universal popularity of the Autobiography can be readily understood. The Book of Genesis, the plays of Shakespeare, Pilgrim's Progress, the novels of Sir Walter Scott, are not more easily illustrated than are the incidents depicted to the life in its early chapters. Some of them wear a hard and coarse aspect, as if they had been struck off from the ruder plates than any belonging to the present state of the art of engraving. But this is only another proof of the fidelity of Franklin to his 18th century background. We might as well quarrel with the squalor and sluttishness of Hogarth's scenes. Poor Richard's Almanac, including The Way to Wealth or Father Abraham's Speech, is Franklin's other master work. One would hardly look to almanac making for a classic contribution to letters, but it is not extravagant to say that Poor Richard is one of the most lifelike figures in the literature of the world. Nestor, Falstaff, Don Quixote, Robinson Crusoe, Sir Roger de Coverley, Captain Dugald Dalgetty, and Colonel Newcome are not more distinctly delineated, or rather we should say are not more manifest to the eye and palpable to the touch. To the people of Pennsylvania, its tradesmen, its farmers, even its rude borderers, he was a personage fully as real as the colonial governor at Philadelphia, and far more popular. Thousands of its inhabitants never turned over the pages of any other book except those of the Bible. And finally, the wise sayings of Poor Richard in the form of The Way to Wealth, applicable as they were to the primal and universal conditions of human existence everywhere, became known from the Thames to the Ganges. The middle of the 18th century was the heyday of almanac making, and the best proof of the durable stuff of which Poor Richard's Almanac was woven is the utter oblivion that has overtaken all his competitors except those who are preserved in his pages like flies in amber. The prefaces of Poor Richard, the proverbial maxims with which his almanacs are bestrewn, the compendious speech on which these maxims are finally strung like bright beads, have survived because they were adapted with consummate art to the simple habits and mental wants of the rude audience to which they were addressed. For upwards of 30 years, Poor Richard, with a distinctness and consistency of character as perfect as those of Santa Claus, made his annual bow to the people of Pennsylvania, and served up to their delighted palates his highly seasoned olla podrida of mock astrology, homely wisdom, and coarse jollity in prose and verse. Sometimes the humour is mere horse laughter, but always the shrewd, worldly, wise, merry, temperate old Philomath and Stargazer hits the fancy of his readers with unerring accuracy between wind and water. His weather predictions and prognostications of planetary conjunctions are just serious enough for unlettered rustics, whose minds have been partially but not wholly disabused of the belief that rain comes with the change of the moon. His proverbs are the proverbs of men whose lives are too meagre and straitened to permit them to forget his saying, "If you will not hear reason, she'll surely rap your knuckles." His humour is the humour of men whose grave, weather-beaten features do not relax into a smile or grin, except under the compelling influence of some broad joke or ridiculous spectacle. Just as the most successful inventor is the one who invents the device that has the widest application to material uses, so the most successful writer is the one who conceives the thoughts that have the widest application to the moral and intellectual needs of mankind. The thoughts that Poor Richard conceived or adopted are such thoughts, for what he taught was full of significance to every man who desires to obtain a correct insight into the moral and economic laws that govern the world for the purpose of winning its favour. which means all men except those who either prey on the world or merely drift along with its current. In the prefaces to his almanac, Poor Richard manages to keep both his wife Bridget and himself close to the footlights. In the first preface he says that if he were to declare that he wrote almanacs with no other view than of the public good, he should not be sincere. The plain truth of the matter is, he confesses, I am excessive poor, and my wife, good woman, is, I tell her, excessive proud. She cannot bear, she says, to sit spinning in her shift of tow, while I do nothing but gaze at the stars, and has threatened more than once to burn all my books and rattling traps, as she calls my instruments, if I do not make some profitable use of them for the good of my family. In the preface of the succeeding year he announces that the patronage of his readers the year before had made his circumstances much easier. His wife had been enabled to get a pot of her own, and was no longer obliged to borrow one from a neighbour, nor had they ever since been without something of their own to put in it. She had also got a pair of shoes, 2 new shifts, a new warm petticoat, and for his part he had bought a second-hand coat so good that he was no longer ashamed to go to town or be seen there. These things had rendered Bridget's temper so much more pacific than it used to be that he might say that he had slept more and more quietly within the last year than in the 3 foregoing years put together. In a later preface he declares that if the generous purchaser of his labours could see how often his 5 pence help to light up the comfortable fire, line the pot, fill the cup, and make glad the heart of a poor man and an honest good old woman, he would not think his money ill laid out, though the almanac of his friend and servant R. Saunders were 1/2 blank paper. A year later, Mr. Saunders avails herself of the fact that her good man had set out the week before for Potomac to visit an old stargazer of his acquaintance, and to see about a little place for the couple to settle and end their days on, to scratch out the preface to the copy of the almanac for that year which he had left behind him for the press, because it had undertaken to let the world know that she, who had already been held out in former prefaces as proud and loud, and the possessor of a new petticoat, had lately, forsooth, taken a fancy to drink a little tea now and then. Upon looking over the months, she saw that he had put in abundance of foul weather this year, and therefore she had scattered here and there, where she could find room, some fair, pleasant, sunshiny days for the good women to dry their clothes in. If what she promised did not come to pass, she would at any rate have shown her good will. In the next preface, referring to the impression that the great yearly demand of his almanac had made him so rich that he should call himself Poor Dick no longer, and pretending that he and the printer were different persons, Poor Richard says, when I first begun to publish, the printer made a fair agreement with me for my copies, by virtue of which he runs away with the greatest part of the profit. However much good may it do him, I do not grudge it him. He is a man I have a great regard for, and I wish his profit 10 times greater than it is, for I am, dear reader, his as well as thy affectionate friend, R. Saunders. But the 5 pence came in too rapidly for the almanac maker to persist in putting up a poor mouth of this kind. In his 12th year, after frankly admitting that he had laboured not for the benefit of the public, but for the benefit of his own dear self, not forgetting in the meantime his gracious consort and duchess, the peaceful, quiet, silent Lady Bridget, he states that whether his labours had been of any service to the public or not, he must acknowledge that they had been of service to him. It was by such personal touches as these that Poor Richard made Bridget and himself as familiar to his patrons as the signs of the zodiac. Astrology itself was of course too good a subject for keen ridicule to be spared. Formerly, Poor Richard declares in one preface, no prince would make war or peace, nor any general fight a battle without first consulting an astrologer, who examined the aspects and configurations of the heavenly bodies, and marked the lucky hour. But now, he goes on, the nobler art, more shame to the age we live in, is dwindled into contempt. The great neglect us. Empires make leagues and parliaments laws without advising with us. and scarce any other use is made of our learned labours than to find the best time of cutting corns or gelding pigs. End of section 32. Section 33 of Benjamin Franklin, Self-Revealed, Volume 2, by William Bruce. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5, Part 6, Franklin as a Writer. In many sly ways, Poor Richard let his readers know that his forecasts are not to be accepted too seriously. It is no wonder, he says in his 5th preface, that among the multitude of astrological predictions some few should fail, for without any defect in the art itself, 'tis well known that a small error, a single wrong figure overseen in a calculation, may occasion great mistakes. But however the almanac makers might miss it in other things, he believed it would be generally allowed that they always hit the day of the month, and that he supposed was esteemed one of the most useful things in an almanac. In another issue of the almanac he indulges in a great variety of confident predictions as to the year 1739. The crabs will go sidelong, and the rope-makers backwards. The belly will wag before, and another part of the body, which we shall not name, but he does, will sit down first. Mercury will so confound the speech of people that when a Pennsylvanian will wish to say panther, he will say painter, and when a New Yorker will attempt to say this, he will say dis, and the people of New England and Cape May will not be able to say cow for their lives, but will be forced to say kee-ow, by a certain involuntary twist in the root of their tongues. As for Connecticut men and Marylanders, they will not be able to open their mouths, but sir shall be the first or last syllable they will pronounce, and sometimes both. Some of his other predictions are that the stone blind will see but very little, the deaf will hear but poorly, and the dumb will not speak very plain, while whole flocks, herds, and droves of sheep, swine, and oxen, cocks and hens, ducks and drakes, geese and ganders will go to pot, but the mortality will not be altogether so great among cats, dogs, and horses. As for age, it will be incurable because of the years past, and towards the fall some people will be seized with an unaccountable inclination to eat their own ears. But the worst disease of all will be a certain most horrid, dreadful, malignant, catching, perverse, and odious malady, almost epidemical, insomuch that many will run mad upon it. I quake for very fear, exclaims Poor Richard, when I think on, for I assure you very few will escape this disease, which is called by the learned Albumazar lacomony, that the orange trees in Greenland will go near to fare the worst for the cold, that oats will be a great help to horses, and that there will not be much more bacon than swine, are still other prophecies hazarded by the astrologer. In another preface he declares that he is gone into retirement, and that it is time for an old man such as he is to think of preparing for his great remove. Then follow these impatient statements. The perpetual teasing of both neighbors and strangers to calculate nativities, give judgments on schemes, erect figures, discover thieves, detect horse stealers, describe the route of runaways and strayed cattle, the crowd of visitors with 1,000 trifling questions. Will my ship return safe? Will my mare win the race? Will her next colt be a pacer? When will my wife die? Who shall be my husband, and how long first? When is the best time to cut hair, trim locks, or sow salad? These and the like impertinences I have now neither taste nor leisure for. I have had enough of 'em. All that these angry folks can say will never provoke me to tell them where I live. I would eat my nails first. At times the hoarse laughter is even slightly favoured with the stercoraceous smell of the stable. Ignorant men, says Poor Richard in his 7th preface, wonder how we astrologers foretell the weather so exactly, unless we deal with the old black devil. Alas, 'tis as easy as, for instance, the star-gazer peeps at the heavens through a long glass. He sees perhaps Taurus or the great bull in a mighty chafe, stamping on the floor of his house, swinging his tail about, stretching out his neck, and opening wide his mouth. 'Tis natural from these appearances to judge that this furious bull is puffing, blowing, and roaring. Distance being considered and time allowed for all this to come down, there you have wind and thunder. He spies perhaps Virgo or the Virgin. She turns her head round as it were to see if anybody observed her. Then crouching down gently with her hands on her knees, she looks wistfully for a while right forward. He judges rightly what she's about, and having calculated the distance and allowed time for its falling, finds that next spring we shall have a fine April shower. In his preface for 1754, Poor Richard advances the proposition that the first astrologers were honest husbandmen, and he proceeds to prove it partly by the names of the zodiacal signs, which were related for the most part, he asserts, to rural affairs. The ram, the bull, the twins, the crab, the lion, the wench, the balance, the scorpion, the archer, the goat, the water-bearer, the fish, one by one, he tells them off in the course of his demonstration, making his own comments on their several meanings as he goes along. The lion and the wench, he says, were intended by the ancients to mark the summer months and dog days, when those creatures were most mischievous. The balance, one of the autumnal signs, was intended by them to mark out the time for weighing and selling the summer's produce, or for holding courts of justice in which they might plague themselves and their neighbours. The scorpion with the sting in his tail certainly denoted the paying of costs. The goat accompanies the short days and long nights of winter, to show the season of mirth, feasting, and jollity. For what could Capricorn mean but dancing or cutting of capers? Lastly came Pisces, or the two shads, to signify the approaching return of those fish up the rivers. Make your wares, haul your seines, catch 'em and pickle 'em, my friends, advised Poor Richard. They are excellent relishers of old cider. But Poor Richard's prefaces are not altogether made up of hearty, hilarious jests and loud guffaws. The raillery with which he plies his rival Philomath, Titan Leeds, would be as admirable as any humour in his writings, if it were not borrowed so manifestly from Dean Swift's ridicule of Partridge, the almanac maker. In his very first preface in 1733, he says that he would have published an almanac many years before had he not been restrained by his regard for his good friend and fellow student, Mr. Titan Leeds, whose interest he was extremely unwilling to hurt. But this obstacle, I'm far from speaking it with pleasure, declares Poor Richard, is soon to be removed, since inexorable death, who was never known to respect merit, has already prepared the mortal dart. The fatal sister has already extended her destroying shears, and that ingenious man must soon be taken from us. He dies, by my calculation made at his request, on October 17, 1733, 3 hours 29 minutes p.m., at the very instant of the symbol for conjunction, symbol for sun, and symbol for Mercury. By his own calculation he will survive till the 26th of the same month. This small difference between us we have disputed whenever we have met these 9 years past, but at length he is inclinable to agree with my judgment. Which of us is most exact, a little time will now determine. As therefore these provinces may not longer expect to see any of his performances after this year, I think myself free to take up the task and request a share of the public encouragement. To these assertions Leeds returned a hot answer in his American Almanac for the succeeding year. Notwithstanding the false prediction of the writer who proposed to succeed him in the writing of almanacs, he had, he said, by the mercy of God, lived to write a diary for the year 1734, and to publish the folly and ignorance of the presumptuous author, whom he did not scruple, in the rising tide of his wrath, to term a fool and a liar, and a conceited scribbler. This, of course, was just what poor Richard was calculating on. In his next preface he is at his very best. In the preface to my last almanac he says, I foretold the death of my dear old friend and fellow student, the learned and ingenious Mr. Titan Leeds, which was to be on the 17th of October, 1733, 3 hours 29 minutes p.m., at the very instant of the symbol for conjunction of symbol for sun and symbol for Mercury. By his own calculation he was to survive till the 26th of the same month and expire in the time of the eclipse, near 11 o'clock a.m., at which of these times he died, or whether he be really yet dead, I cannot at present writing positively assure my readers. Forasmuch as a disorder in my own family demanded my presence, and would not permit me, as I had intended, to be with him in his last moments, to receive his last embrace, to close his eyes and do the duty of a friend in performing the last offices to the departed. Therefore it is that I cannot positively affirm whether he be dead or not, for the stars only show to the skilful what will happen in the natural and universal chain of causes and effects. But 'tis well known that the events which would otherwise certainly happen at certain times in the course of nature are sometimes set aside or postponed for wise and good reasons by the immediate particular dispositions of Providence, which particular dispositions the stars can by no means discover or foreshow. There is, however, and I cannot speak it without sorrow, there is the strongest probability that my dear friend is no more, for there appears in his name, as I am assured, an almanac for the year 1734, in which I am treated in a very gross and unhandsome manner, in which I am called a false predictor, an ignorant, a conceited scribbler, a fool, and a liar. Mr. Leeds was too well bred to use any man so indecently and so scurrilously, and moreover his esteem and affection for me was extraordinary, so that it is to be feared that pamphlet may be only a contrivance of somebody or other, who hopes perhaps to sell 2 or 3 years' almanac still by the sole force and virtue of Mr. Leeds' name, but certainly to put words into the mouth of a gentleman and a man of letters against his friend, which the meanest and most scandalous of the people might be ashamed to utter, even in a drunken quarrel, is an unpardonable injury to his memory and an imposition upon the public. Mr. Leeds was not only profoundly skilful in the useful science he professed, but he was a man of exemplary sobriety, a most sincere friend, and an exact performer of his word. These valuable qualifications, with many others, so much endeared him to me, that although it should be so that, contrary to all probability, contrary to my prediction and his own, he might possibly be yet alive, yet my loss of honour as a prognosticator cannot afford me so much mortification as his life, health, and safety would give me joy and satisfaction. By these observations the burden was again imposed upon Titan Leeds of demonstrating that he was still alive, and accordingly in his next preface his indignant shade did not fail to take notice of them. But with the succeeding revolution of the earth about the sun, poor Richard was at his sport again. Whatever may be the music of the spheres, he said, how great soever the harmony of the stars, 'tis certain there is no harmony among the star-gazers, but they are perpetually growling and snarling at one another like strange curs, or like some men at their wives. I had resolved to keep the peace on my own part, and affront none of them, and I shall persist in that resolution. But having received much abuse from Titan Leeds, deceased Titan Leeds, when living, would not have used me so. I say, having received much abuse from the ghost of Titan Leeds, who pretends to be still living and to write almanacs in spite of me and my predictions, I cannot help saying that, though I take it patiently, I take it very unkindly. And whatever he may pretend, 'tis undoubtedly true that he is really defunct and dead, first because the stars are seldom disappointed, never but in the case of wise men, sapiens dominibitur astris, and they foreshadowed his death at the time I predicted it. Secondly, 'twas requisite and necessary he should die punctually at that time, for the honour of astrology, the art professed both by him and his father before him. Thirdly, 'tis plain to every one that reads his two last almanacs, for 1734 and 35, that they are not written with that life his performances used to be written with. The wit is low and flat, the little hints dull and spiritless, nothing smart in them but Hudibras's verses against astrology at the heads of the months in the last, which no astrologer but a dead one would have inserted, and no man living would or could write such stuff as the rest. In a later preface, poor Richard complains that certain ill-willers of his, despited at the great reputation that he had gained by exactly predicting another man's death, had endeavoured to deprive him of it all at once in the most effective manner, by reporting that he himself was never alive. It was not civil treatment, he said, to endeavour to deprive him of his very being, and to reduce him to a non-entity in the opinion of the public. But so long as he knew himself to walk about, eat, drink, and sleep, he was satisfied that there was really such a man as he was, whatever they might say to the contrary. As his printers seemed as unwilling to father his offspring as he was to lose the credit of them, to clear him entirely, as well as to vindicate his own honour, he made this public and serious declaration, which he desired might be believed, to wit, that what he had written theretofore, and did now write, neither had been nor was written by any other man, or men, persons, or persons whatsoever. Those who were not satisfied with this must needs be very unreasonable. To cap the climax of all this fun, poor Richard finally published in one of his prefaces a letter alleged by him to have been written to him by Titan Leeds from the other world, which stated that the writer was grieved at the aspersions cast on poor Richard by avaricious publishers of almanacs, who envied his success and pretended that the writer remained alive many years after the hour predicted for his death by poor Richard, and certified that he, Titan Leeds, did die presently at that hour, with a variation only of 5 minutes 53 seconds, which must be allowed to be of no greater matter in such cases. Nay, more, in this letter Titan Leeds was made to predict that another Pennsylvania philomath and competitor of poor Richard, one John German, would be openly reconciled to the Church of Rome, and give all his goods and chattels to the chapel, being perverted by a certain country schoolmaster. In a former year, poor Richard had already charged German with making such flexible prophecies as snow here or in New England, rain here or in South Carolina, cold to the northward, warm to the southward. If he were to adopt that method, he said he would not be so likely to have his mistakes detected, but he did not consider that it would be of any service to anybody to know what weather it was 1,000 miles off, and therefore he always set down positively what weather his reader would have, be he where he might be at that time. All he modestly desired was only the favourable allowance of a day or two before and a day or two after the precise day against which the weather was set. On another previous occasion, poor Richard had made his readers a promise about German, which he does not seem to have ever redeemed. When my brother Gemin, he said, erected a scheme to know which was best for his sick horse, to sup a new-laid egg or a little broth, he found that the stars plainly gave their verdict for broth, and the horse having supped his broth, now what do you think became of that horse? You shall know in my next. When the prediction of Titan Leeds from beyond the grave that German would apostatize was duly published, the latter resented it, and in his almanac for the year 1742, Poor Richard felt it necessary to say a word about the matter himself. "My last adversary," he declared, "is J.J.N. Philomat, who declares and protests in his preface 1741 that the false prophecy put in my almanac concerning him the year before is altogether false and untrue, and that I am one of Baal's false prophets. This false prophecy he speaks of related to his reconciliation with the Church of Rome, which notwithstanding his declaring and protesting is, I fear, too true. Two things in his elegiac verses confirm me in this suspicion. He calls the 1st of November by the name of All Hallows Day. Reader, does not this smell of popery? Does it in the least savour of the pure language of friends? But the plainest thing is his adoration of saints, which he confesses to be his practice in these words, page 4. When any trouble did me befall, to my dear Mary then I would call. Did he think the whole world were so stupid as not to take notice of this, so ignorant as not to know that all Catholics pay the highest regard to the Virgin Mary? Ah, friend John, we must allow you to be a poet, but you are certainly no Protestant. I could heartily wish your religion were as good as your verses." Mingled with the other contents of Poor Richard's almanac were pointed maxims and sayings worthy of Lord John Russell's happy definition of a proverb, the wit of one and the wisdom of many, and at times first or second-hand verses also. Among the best of the latter are the following. When Robin, now 3 days, had married been, and all his friends and neighbours gave him joy, this question of his wife he asked then, why till her marriage day she proved so coy. "Indeed," said he, "'twas well thou didst not yield, for doubtless then my purpose was to leave thee. O sir, I once before was so beguiled, and was resolved the next should not deceive me." Poetry for December 1734. By Mrs. Bridget Saunders, my Duchess, in answer to the December verses of last year. He that for the sake of drink neglects his trade, and spends each night in taverns till 'tis late, and rises when the sun is 4 hours high, and ne'er regards his starving family, God in his mercy may do much to save him, but woe to the poor wife whose lot is to have him. Time eateth all things, good old poets say, but times are changed, our times drink all away. Old bachelor would have a wife that's wise, fair, rich, and young, a maiden for his bed, not proud nor churlish, but of faultless size, a country housewife in the city bred. He's a nice fool, and long in vain hath stayed, he should bespeak her, there's done ready-made. And this is Poor Richard's version of how Cupid and Campaspe played for kisses. My love and I for kisses played. She would keep stakes, I was content, but when I won, she would be paid. This made me ask her what she meant. Quoth she, since you are in the wrangling vein, here, take your kisses, give me mine again. The first preface to Poor Richard's Almanac appeared in the issue for 1733. In 1758, the proverbs and sayings scattered through the preceding issues of the publication were assembled in the Way to Wealth or Father Abraham's Speech. Even John Bach McMaster, in his brief though admirable work on Franklin as a man of letters, found that he could not abridge this renowned production, so we offer no apology for inserting it here in its entirety. Courteous reader, I have heard that nothing gives an author so much pleasure as to find his works respectfully quoted by other learned authors. This pleasure I've seldom enjoyed, for though I have been, if I must say it without vanity, an eminent author of almanacs annually now a full quarter of a century, my brother authors in the same way, for what reason I know not, have ever been very sparing in their applauses, and no other author has taken the least notice of me, so that did my writings produce me some solid pudding, the great deficiency of praise would have quite discouraged me. I concluded at length that the people were the best judges of my merit, for they buy my works, and besides in my rambles where I am not personally known, I have frequently heard one or other of my adages repeated, with, as poor Richard says, at the end on't. This gave me some satisfaction, as it showed not only that my instructions were regarded, but discovered likewise some respect for my authority. And I own that to encourage the practice of remembering and repeating those wise sentences, I've sometimes quoted myself with great gravity. Judge then how much I must have been gratified by an incident I'm going to relate to you. I stopped my horse lately where a great number of people were collected at a vendue of merchant goods. The hour of sale not being come, they were conversing on the badness of the times, and one of the company called to a plain, clean old man with white locks, "Pray, Father Abraham, what think you of the times? Won't these heavy taxes quite ruin the country? How shall we be ever able to pay them? What would you advise us to?" Father Abraham stood up and replied, "If you'd have my advice, I give it you in short, for a word to the wise is enough, and many words won't fill a bushel, as poor Richard says." They joined in desiring him to speak his mind, and gathering round him, he proceeded as follows. "Friends," says he, "and neighbours, the taxes are indeed very heavy, and if those laid on by the government were the only ones we had to pay, we might more easily discharge them. But we have many others, and much more grievous to some of us. We are taxed twice as much by our idleness, 3 times as much by our pride, and 4 times as much by our folly. And from these taxes the commissioners cannot ease or deliver us by allowing an abatement. However, let us hearken to good advice, and something may be done for us. God helps them that help themselves, as poor Richard says in his almanac of 1733. It would be thought a hard government that should tax its people 1/10 part of their time to be employed in its service, but idleness taxes many of us much more, if we reckon all that is spent in absolute sloth, or doing of nothing, with that which is spent in idle employments or amusements that amount to nothing. Sloth, by bringing on diseases, absolutely shortens life. Sloth, like rust, consumes faster than labour wears, while the used key is always bright, as poor Richard says. But dost thou love life, then do not squander time, for that's the stuff life is made of, as poor Richard says. How much more than is necessary do we spend in sleep, forgetting that the sleeping fox catches no poultry, and that there will be sleeping enough in the grave, as poor Richard says. If time be of all things the most precious, wasting time must be, as poor Richard says, the greatest prodigality, since, as he elsewhere tells us, lost time is never found again, and what we call time enough always proves little enough. Let us then be up and doing to the purpose, so by diligence shall we do more with less perplexity. Sloth makes all things difficult, but industry all easy, as poor Richard says, and neither riseth late, must trot all day, and shall scarce overtake his business at night, while laziness travels so slowly that poverty soon overtakes him. As we read in poor Richard, who adds, "Drive thy business, let not that drive thee," and early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. So what signifies wishing and hoping for better times? We may make these times better if we bestir ourselves. Industry need not wish, as poor Richard says, and he that lives upon hope will die fasting. There are no gains without pains. Then help hands, for I have no lands, or if I have, they are smartly taxed. And as poor Richard likewise observes, he that hath a trade hath an estate, and he that hath a calling hath an office of profit and honour. But then the trade must be worked at, and the calling well followed, or neither the estate nor the office will enable us to pay our taxes. If we are industrious, we shall never starve. For as poor Richard says, at the working man's house hunger looks in, but dares not enter. Nor will the bailiff or the constable enter, for industry pays debts, while despair increaseth them, says poor Richard. What though you have found no treasure, nor has any rich relation left you a legacy? Diligence is the mother of good luck, as poor Richard says, and God gives all things to industry. Then plough deep while sluggards sleep, and you shall have corn to sell and to keep, says poor Dick. Work while it is called today, for you know not how much you may be hindered tomorrow, which makes poor Richard say, One to-day is worth 2 tomorrows. And farther, have you somewhat to do tomorrow? Do it today. If you were a servant, would you not be ashamed that a good master should catch you idle? Are you then your own master? Be ashamed to catch yourself idle, as poor Dick says, when there is so much to be done for yourself, your family, your country, and your gracious king. Be up by peep of day. Let not the sun look down and say, Inglorious, here he lies. Handle your tools without mittens. Remember that the cat in gloves catches no mice, as poor Richard says. 'Tis true there is much to be done, and perhaps you are weak-handed, but stick to it steadily, and you will see great effects, for constant dropping wears away stones, and by diligence and patience the mouse ate into the cable, and little strokes fell great oaks, as poor Richard says in his almanac, the year I cannot just now remember. Methinks I hear some of you say, Must a man afford himself no leisure? I will tell thee, my friend, what poor Richard says, Employ thy time well, if thou meanest to gain leisure. And since thou art not sure of a minute, throw not away an hour. Leisure is time for doing something useful. This leisure the diligent man will obtain, but the lazy man never. So that, as poor Richard says, a life of leisure and a life of laziness are 2 things. Do you imagine that sloth will afford you more comfort than labour? No, for as poor Richard says, trouble springs from idleness, and grievous toil from needless ease. Many without labour would live by their wits only, but they break for want of stock, whereas industry gives comfort and plenty and respect. Fly pleasures, and they'll follow you. The diligent spinner has a large shift, and now I have a sheep and a cow. Everybody bids me good morrow, all which is well said by poor Richard. But with our industry we must likewise be steady, settled, and careful, and oversee our own affairs with our own eyes, and not trust too much to others. For as poor Richard says, I never saw an oft-removed tree, nor yet an oft-removed family, that throve so well as those that settled be. And again, 3 removes is as bad as a fire. And again, keep thy shop, and thy shop will keep thee. And again, if you would have your business done, go, if not, send. And again, he that by the plough would thrive, himself must either hold or drive. And again, the eye of a master will do more work than both his hands. And again, want of care does us more damage than want of knowledge. And again, not to oversee workmen is to leave them your purse open. Trusting too much to others' care is the ruin of many, for as the almanac says, in the affairs of this world men are saved not by faith, but by the want of it. But a man's own care is profitable, for, saith poor Dick, learning is to the studious, and riches to the careful, as well as power to the bold, and heaven to the virtuous. And farther, if you would have a faithful servant, and one that you like, serve yourself. And again, he adviseth to circumspection and care, even in the smallest matters, because sometimes a little neglect may breed great mischief, adding, for want of a nail the shoe was lost, for want of a shoe the horse was lost, and for want of a horse the rider was lost, being overtaken and slain by the enemy, all for want of care about a horse shoe nail. So much for industry, my friends, and attention to one's own business, but to these we must add frugality, if we would make our industry more certainly successful. A man may, if he knows not how to save as he gets, keep his nose all his life to the grindstone, and die not worth a groat at last. A fat kitchen makes a lean will, as poor Richard says, and many estates are spent in the getting, since women for tea forsook spinning and knitting, and men for punch forsook hewing and splitting. If you would be wealthy, says he in another almanac, think of saving as well as of getting. The Indies have not made Spain rich because her outgoes are greater than her incomes. Away then with your expensive follies, and you will not then have so much cause to complain of hard times, heavy taxes, and chargeable families, for, as poor Dick says, women and wine, game and deceit, make the wealth small and the wants great. And farther, what maintains one vice would bring up 2 children. You may think, perhaps, that a little tea or a little punch, now and then diet a little more costly, clothes a little finer, and a little entertainment now and then, can be no great matter. But remember what poor Richard says, many a little makes a mickle. And farther, beware of little expenses. A small leak will sink a great ship. And again, who dainties love shall beggars prove. And moreover, fools make feasts, and wise men eat them. Here you are all got together at this vendue of fineries and knickknacks. You call them goods, but if you do not take care, they will prove evils to some of you. You expect they will be sold cheap, and perhaps they may, for less than they cost, but if you have no occasion for them, they must be dear to you. Remember what poor Richard says, buy what thou hast no need of, and ere long thou shalt sell thy necessaries. And again, at a great pennyworth, called pause a while. He means that perhaps the cheapness is apparent only, and not real, or the bargain by straightening thee in thy business may do thee more harm than good. For in another place he says many have been ruined by buying good pennyworths. Again, poor Richard says 'tis foolish to lay out money in a purchase of repentance, and yet this folly is practised every day at vendues, for want of minding the almanac. Wise men, as poor Dick says, learn by others' harms, fools scarcely by their own. But felix quem puciunt aliena pericula cautem. Many a one, for the sake of finery on the back, have gone with a hungry belly, and half starved their families. Silks and satins, scarlet and velvets, as poor Richard says, put out the kitchen fire. These are not the necessities of life. They can scarcely be called conveniences, and yet only because they look pretty how many want to have them. The artificial wants of mankind thus become more numerous than the natural, and as poor Richard says, for one poor person there are 100 indigent. By these and other extravagancies the genteel are reduced to poverty and forced to borrow of those whom they formerly despised, but who through industry and frugality have maintained their standing, in which case it appears plainly that the ploughman on his legs is higher than a gentleman on his knees, as poor Richard says. Perhaps they have had a small estate left them, which they knew not the getting of. They think 'tis day and will never be night, that a little to be spent out of so much is not worth minding. A child and a fool, as poor Richard says, imagine 20 shillings and 20 years can never be spent, but always taking out of the meal tub and never putting in, soon comes to the bottom. As poor Dick says, when the well's dry, they know the worth of water. But this they might have known before if they had taken his advice. If you would know the value of money, go and try to borrow some, for he that goes a-borrowing goes a-sorrowing. And indeed, so does he that lends to such people when he goes to get it in again. Poor Dick farther advises and says, fond pride of dress is sure a very curse. Ere fancy you consult your purse. And again, pride is as loud a beggar as want, and a great deal more saucy. When you have bought one fine thing, you must buy 10 more, that your appearance may be all of a piece. But poor Dick says 'tis easier to suppress the first desire than to satisfy all that follow it, and 'tis as truly folly for the poor to ape the rich as for the frog to swell in order to equal the ox. Great estates may venture more, but little boats should keep near shore. 'Tis, however, a folly soon punished, for pride that dines on vanity sups on contempt, as poor Richard says, and in another place, pride breakfasted with plenty, dined with poverty, and supped with infamy. And after all, of what use is this pride of appearance, for which so much is risked, so much is suffered? It cannot promote health, or ease pain. It makes no increase of merit in the person. It creates envy. It hastens misfortune. What is a butterfly? At best, he's but a caterpillar dressed. The gaudy fop's his picture just, as poor Richard says. But what madness must it be to run in debt for these superfluities? We are offered by the terms of this vendue 6 months' credit, and that perhaps has induced some of us to attend it, because we cannot spare the ready money, and hope now to be fine without it. But think what you do when you run in debt. You give to another power over your liberty. If you cannot pay at the time, you will be ashamed to see your creditor. You will be in fear when you speak to him. You will make poor, pitiful, sneaking excuses, and by degrees come to lose your veracity and sink into base, downright lying. For as Poor Richard says, the second vice is lying, the first is running in debt, and again to the same purpose lying rides upon debt's back, whereas a free-born Englishman ought not to be ashamed or afraid to see or speak to any man living. But poverty often deprives a man of all spirit and virtue. 'Tis hard for an empty bag to stand upright, as Poor Richard truly says. What would you think of that prince or that government who should issue an edict forbidding you to dress like a gentleman or a gentlewoman, or on pain of imprisonment or servitude? Would you not say that you were free, have a right to dress as you please, and that such an edict would be a breach of your privileges, and such a government tyrannical? And yet you are about to put yourself under that tyranny when you run in debt for such dress. Your creditor has authority at his pleasure to deprive you of your liberty by confining you in jail for life, or to sell you for a servant if you should not be able to pay him. When you have got your bargain, you may perhaps think little of payment, but creditors, Poor Richard tells us, have better memories than debtors, and in another place says creditors are a superstitious sect, great observers of set days and times. The day comes round before you are aware, and the demand is made before you are prepared to satisfy it. Or if you bear your debt in mind, the term which at first seems so long will, as it lessens, appear extremely short. Time will seem to have added wings to his heels as well as shoulders. Those have a short Lent, saith Poor Richard, who owe money to be paid at Easter. Then since, as he says, the borrower is a slave to the lender, and the debtor to the creditor, disdain the chain, preserve your freedom, and maintain your independency. Be industrious and free, be frugal and free. At present, perhaps you may think yourself in thriving circumstances, and that you can bear a little extravagance without injury. But for age and want, save while you may. No morning sun lasts a whole day. As Poor Richard says, gain may be temporary and uncertain, but ever while you live, expense is constant and certain, and 'tis easier to build 2 chimneys than to keep one in fuel, as Poor Richard says, so rather go to bed supperless than rise in debt. Get what you can, and what you get hold. 'Tis the stone that will turn all your lead into gold, as Poor Richard says, and when you have got the philosopher's stone, sure you will no longer complain of bad times or the difficulty of paying taxes. This doctrine, my friends, is reason and wisdom, but after all, do not depend too much upon your own industry and frugality and prudence, though excellent things, for they may all be blasted without the blessing of heaven, and therefore ask that blessing humbly, and be not uncharitable to those that at present seem to want it, but comfort and help them. Remember, Job suffered and was afterwards prosperous. And now to conclude, experience keeps a dear school, but fools will learn in no other, and scarce in that, for it is true we may give advice, but we cannot give conduct, as Poor Richard says. However, remember this, that they won't be counselled, can't be helped, as Poor Richard says, and farther, that if you will not hear reason, she'll surely rap your knuckles. Thus the old gentleman ended his harangue. The people heard it and approved the doctrine, and immediately practised the contrary, just as if it had been a common sermon. For the vendue opened, and they began to buy extravagantly, notwithstanding his cautions and their own fear of taxes. I found the good man had thoroughly studied my almanacs, and digested all I had dropped on these topics during the course of 25 years. The frequent mention he made of me must have tired any one else, but my vanity was wonderfully delighted with it, though I was conscious that not a 10th part of the wisdom was my own, which he ascribed to me, but rather the gleanings I had made of the sense of all ages and nations. However, I resolved to be the better for the echo of it, and though I had at first determined to buy stuff for a new coat, I went away resolved to wear my old one a little longer. Reader, if thou wilt do the same, thy profit will be as great as mine. I am, as ever, thine to serve thee, Richard Saunders. Imperfect as this chapter is, it is adequate enough, we hope, to make the reader feel that Sydney Smith was not altogether insensible to natural obligations when he told his daughter that he would disinherit her if she did not admire everything written by Franklin. End of section 33. Section 34 of Benjamin Franklin, Self-Revealed, Volume 2, by William Bruce. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Summary. Such was Benjamin Franklin, as mirrored for the most part in his own written and oral utterances, whether his fame was measured by what he actually accomplished or by the impression that he made upon his contemporaries, or by the influence that he still exercises over the human mind. He was a truly great man, not simply because he was one of the principal actors in a revolutionary movement destined to establish in the free air of the Western world, on lasting foundations and on a scale of moral and material grandeur of which history furnishes few examples, a state without king, noble, or pontiff, and deriving its inspiration and energy solely from the will of the people, nor yet merely because his brilliant discoveries in the province of electricity conspicuously helped to convert one of the most elusive and defiant of all the forces of nature into an humble and useful drudge of modern industry and progress, nor yet merely because, in addition to many other productions marked by the indefinable charm of unerring literary intuition, he wrote several which are read in every part of the globe where a printed page is read, nor even because of all these things combined. They are, of course, the main pillars upon which his splendid fame rests. But what imparts to Franklin his aspect of greatness and endows him with his irresistible appeal to the interest and admiration of the whole human race is the striking extent to which he was, in point of both precept and example, representative of human existence in all its more rational, more fruitful, and more sympathetic manifestations. His vision was not that of the enthusiast. His was no Pentecostal tongue, cloven and aflame. He took little account of the higher spiritual forces which at times deranged all the sober, prudent calculations of such a materialist as Poor Richard, and his message to mankind was blemished, as we have seen, by the excessive emphasis placed by it upon pecuniary thrift and the relations of pecuniary thrifts to sound morals as well as physical comfort. But all the same, limited to the terrestrial horizon as he is, he must be reckoned one of the great leaders and teachers of humanity. He loved existence, shared it joyously and generously with his fellow creatures, and vindicated its essential worth by bringing to bear upon everything connected with the conduct of life the maxims of a serene and almost infallible wisdom, and by responding with a mind as completely free from the prejudices and errors of his age as if he had lived 100 years later, and with a heart as completely unconstrained by local considerations as if men were all of one blood and one country, to every suggestion that tended to make human beings happier, more intelligent, and worthier in every respect of the universe, which he found so delightful. It is this harmony with the world about him, this insight into what that world requires of every one who seeks to make his way in it, this enlightenment, this sympathy with human aspirations and needs everywhere, together with the rare strain of graphic and kindly instruction by which they were accompanied, that caused the name of Franklin to be so often associated with those of the other great men whose fame is not the possession of a single class or land, but of all mankind. The result is that when the faces of the few individuals who are recognized by the entire world as having, in the different ages of human history, rendered service to the entire world, are ranged in plastic repose above the shelves of some public library or along the walls of some other institution founded for the promotion of human knowledge or well-being, the calm, meditative face of Franklin is rarely missing. It is to be regretted that a character so admirable and amiable in all leading respects as his, so strongly fortified by the cardinal virtues of modesty, veracity, integrity, and courage, and so sweetly flavoured with all the finer charities of human benevolence and affection, should in some particulars have fallen short of proper standards of conduct. But it is only just to remember that the measure of his lapses from correct conduct is to be mainly found in humorous license, for which the best men of his own age, like Dr. Price and Charles Carroll of Carrollton, had only a laugh, and in offences against sexual morality, which, except so far as they assumed in his youth the form of casual intercourse with low women, whose reputations were already too sorely injured to be further wounded, consisted altogether in the adoption by a singularly versatile nature of a foreign code of manners, which imposed upon the members of the society by which it was formed the necessity of affecting the language of gallantry, even when gallantry itself was not actually practised. There is at any rate no evidence to show that the long married life of Franklin, so full of domestic concord and tenderness, was ever sullied by the slightest violation of conjugal fidelity. On the whole, therefore, it is not strange that, repelled as we are at times by some passing episode or revelation in his life or character, every one who has lingered upon his career finds it hard to turn away from it, except with something akin to the feelings of those friends who clung to him so fondly. He was so kind, so considerate, so affectionate, so eager to do good both to individuals and whole communities, that we half forget the human conventions that his bountiful intellect and heart overflowed. Of him it can at least be said that if he had some of a man's failings, he had all of a man's merits, and his biographer, in taking leave of him, may well, mindful of his eminent virtues as well as of his brilliant achievements and services, waive all defence of the few vulnerable features of his life and conduct by summing up the final balance of his deserts in the single word engraved upon the pedestal of one of his busts in Paris at the time of his death. That word was vir, a man, a very man. End of section 34. End of Benjamin Franklin, Self-Revealed, Volume 2, by William Bruce.